Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can. Maybe you're already in bed. Maybe you're sitting on the couch with one light on, half listening to the room around you, letting the day finally loosen its grip. And tonight, we are going to New York City. But not the postcard version of New York City. Not the bright, clean skyline, not the theatre marquees, not the restaurants with little candles on the tables, and definitely not the television cooking competition that borrowed the name and made it sound almost funny. Tonight, we are going to the old west side of Manhattan, to the blocks west of 8th Avenue where the city once seemed to forget itself, where the streets ran toward the Hudson River and the river brought work, hunger, noise, smoke, bodies, money and trouble. We're going to the place that came to be called Hell's Kitchen, and we're going to ask a simple question that turns out not to be simple at all. How does a neighbourhood become dangerous? Not just poor, not just rough around the edges, not just the kind of place respectable people whisper about, but genuinely feared. How does a patch of city blocks become a name people use as a warning? Because that is what Hell's Kitchen became. For generations, it was not only a neighbourhood, it was a reputation. It was the place parents told their children not to wander into. It was the place policemen entered with caution. Reporters described with a little too much excitement. Reformers studied with alarm, and gangsters treated as home. And like most frightening places in history, it did not begin as frightening. That is one of the things I want you to hold in your mind tonight. Places are not born bad. Streets do not come into the world violent. Brick buildings do not decide to become tenements full of desperation. A neighbourhood becomes dangerous slowly through pressure, neglect, hunger, bad planning, cheap construction, overcrowding, bad luck, and the ordinary human need to survive when survival has been made unnecessarily hard. Hell's Kitchen was not one decision. It was a long accumulation. A quiet, rural edge of Manhattan became an industrial borderland. An industrial borderland became a crowded immigrant district. A crowded immigrant district became a place where boys grew up learning that a fist, a knife, a stolen crate, or the protection of a gang might keep food on the table more reliably than the law ever did. And somewhere along the way, the city looked at those blocks and gave them a name fit for a warning. Before we go too far into the smoke and the rail yards and the saloons and the boys with broken noses standing under gas lamps, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere quiet? Somewhere with traffic outside, somewhere with rain at the window, somewhere so still that you can hear the little sounds a house makes after dark? I always like thinking about that. Someone listening from a bedroom in one country, someone else from a kitchen table in another, all of us turning our attention toward the same old streets. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy history told slowly, not as a list of dates, but as a place you can almost step into, it would mean the world to me if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when the story catches you. Do it when some small detail makes you stop and think, yes, that is the part of history I never imagined. And if you want to tell me where you are watching from, or what time it is where you are, leave it in the comments. I genuinely love reading those because history feels different when you remember that everyone listening is sitting in a real room somewhere, with their own little circle of light, while we talk about people who lived and worked and worried and slept in rooms that are gone now. Now, let us go back. Not to the Hell's Kitchen of restaurants and apartment towers, not to the Midtown West of real estate brochures, not to the blocks where theatre people and commuters and tourists now move through without any real sense of what once pressed against those sidewalks. Let us go back to the western edge of Manhattan before the name became famous, before the gangs became legend, before the newspapers learned to love the phrase Hell's Kitchen because it looked so good in print. Imagine Manhattan when the city has not yet hardened all the way north. The island is still stretching upward, still deciding what it will become. Downtown is already crowded, already busy, already loud with trade and politics and ships and ambition. but the far west side above the crowded lower wards has not yet been swallowed whole. There are still open spaces, rocky lots, scattered houses, stretches of land that feel almost separate from the city below. The Hudson River is there, wide and useful. Not scenic in the modern sense, not a view for expensive windows, but a working river, a road made of water. It carries timber, coal, grain, passengers, barrels, animals, refuse, hope, and disease. It is beautiful, yes, because rivers usually are, but it is not there to be admired, it is there to be used. That matters, because the river is the first great force in this story. Long before Hell's Kitchen was known for knives and gangs and saloons, it was known by its position. It was the westward edge, the place close to the docks, close to shipping, close to the kind of labour that turns young bodies old. A city always puts certain things near the water. Warehouses, stables, slaughterhouses, gasworks, rail yards, factories, lumber yards. The places that smell too strongly, or make too much noise, or require too many carts and too much waste to sit politely beside the homes of people with money. The West Side became useful before it became respectable, and in New York, usefulness could be a dangerous thing. Useful places attract work. Work attracts workers. Workers need housing. Cheap housing becomes crowded housing. Crowded housing becomes sickness, anger, exhaustion, and competition. And competition, when there is not enough space, not enough money, and not enough protection, has a way of turning into violence. The history of Hell's Kitchen is not simply the history of criminals. It is the history of conditions that made criminal life seem possible, and sometimes practical, to people who saw very few other doors open. By the middle of the 1800s, the West Side began changing quickly. The Hudson River Railroad, later tied to the New York Central system, helped pull the western edge of Manhattan into the machinery of commerce. Tracks ran along 11th Avenue, and the avenue became known for danger in a very literal sense. Trains, carts, horses, pedestrians, children, labourers, and freight all moved through the same rough city space. Before grade separations and modern safety rules, the railroad did not simply pass through the neighbourhood. It cut into daily life. It brought jobs, but it also brought noise, accidents, and a constant reminder that industry was allowed to move through the lives of poor people with a force that no one would have tolerated on a fashionable avenue. Around the rail line came the businesses that fed off transportation. Coal yards, factories, slaughterhouses, breweries, tanneries, warehouses, lumber, stables. Places where men worked with their backs, where a day's pay depended on a body being strong enough to lift, drag, shovel, load, carry, and endure. The air itself would have told you where you were. Smoke from coal fires, animal smells from slaughterhouses and stables, damp rot from the river, beer from breweries, waste from streets that could not be kept clean enough, and the sour human smell of too many people living too close together. We sometimes talk about old neighbourhoods as if poverty were mostly visual, as if the main evidence was ragged clothing or cracked windows. But poverty had a smell, it had a sound, it had a temperature in winter and summer. It lived in stairwells, in bed linens that never fully dried, in cellar rooms, in shared privies, in the cough of a child who had breathed bad air for too long. To understand Hell's Kitchen, you have to understand that the neighbourhood was built out of pressures that touch the body every hour. A man did not leave a quiet home and choose trouble because he liked the romance of danger. He left a crowded room where there might be too many children, too little food, an exhausted mother, a father injured or drunk or unemployed, and a street outside that had already taught him its rules. Then came the immigrants, especially the Irish, many of them driven from Ireland by hunger, poverty, and the great catastrophe of famine. They arrived in New York with need already following them. They did not arrive as characters in a story about crime. They arrived as families looking for work, shelter, and a place in a city that needed their labour and often despised their presence. The docks and rail yards offered work, but that work was uncertain and brutal. A man might be hired by the day, chosen from a crowd, paid little and replaced easily. The city wanted his hands, his shoulders, his youth, but it did not necessarily want him. That's an important distinction. New York was always hungry for labour, but it was not always kind to labourers. In Hell's Kitchen, Irish families crowded into tenements and shanties close to the places where work might be found. They built social worlds in the middle of hardship: churches, saloons, mutual aid, corner loyalties, families who knew which grocer might extend credit and which landlord would not wait. But poverty has a way of making every relationship more tense. The wall between neighbourly closeness and neighbourly conflict can be very thin when people are packed too tightly and nobody has enough. A clothes line, a hallway, a barrel of coal, a missing tool, a drunken insult, a job taken by someone else, a rumour repeated at the wrong table. In a comfortable neighbourhood, these things might pass as irritations. In a desperate one, they could become fights. And Hell's Kitchen became famous for fights. That is part of where the name begins to make sense. The origin of the phrase Hell's Kitchen is disputed, and that uncertainty is actually useful because it tells us something about the neighbourhood. Some stories connect it to a specific tenement. Others connect it to policemen, reporters, local toughs, or a saloon. Some say there was already a phrase like it in London, another slum with the same terrible nickname. There is no single clean birth certificate for the name, no one moment where the neighbourhood is baptised in ink and everyone agrees. Instead, the name seems to rise out of the same atmosphere as the place itself. People needed a phrase for these blocks, for the heat, the smoke, the fights, the density, the sense that ordinary rules grew weaker the farther west you walked. Hell's Kitchen sounded exaggerated, but exaggeration sometimes sticks, because it expresses what people already feel. And what people felt was that this part of Manhattan was different. It had an edge. It had corners where a stranger watched his step. It had boys who did not lower their eyes. It had saloons where disputes did not stay verbal for long. It had streets that could feel almost self-governing after dark. That is the thing about dangerous neighbourhoods. The danger is not present at every second. People still fall in love there. They still cook supper. They still sing, pray, laugh, gossip, raise children, sweep steps, mend clothes, and worry about rent. The mistake outsiders make is imagining only violence, as if every hour were a knife fight. But the people inside the neighbourhood live full human lives there. They know which streets are worse, which men are best avoided, which policeman can be trusted, which grocer waters the milk, which saloon has trouble on Saturday nights, which family is grieving, which boy is becoming dangerous. Hell's Kitchen was never only a den of criminals, it was a working neighbourhood under severe strain. That is what makes the story more interesting and more troubling than the legend. Because the legend lets us point and say, those people were violent. History asks a harder question. What had to happen around ordinary people for violence to become one of the neighbourhood's accepted languages? Think about a boy growing up there in the late 1800s. Not a famous gangster yet. Not Oni Madden, not a gopher, not a name in a newspaper. Just a boy in a crowded tenement near the river. He wakes to noise. Wagons, footsteps, shouting, bells, trains, animals, factory whistles. The hard morning sounds of a city already moving before he's fully awake. The room is too crowded. Privacy is almost non-existent. The adults are tired. Work is not guaranteed. School may be brief or irregular, because children in poor families often entered the economy early, selling papers, running errands, carrying parcels, stealing when the opportunity came, watching older boys and learning what power looked like. And what did power look like on those streets? It did not look like a judge in a courtroom. It did not look like a teacher with a book. It did not look like a gentleman with a bank account. Power looked like the boy who could hit hardest and not cry. The man who could walk into a saloon and make others move aside. The gang that could protect its own and punish outsiders. The local leader who could find someone work, settle a dispute, intimidate a witness, or make trouble disappear. In a neighbourhood where official systems seemed distant or hostile, unofficial systems grew. That is one of the oldest patterns in urban history. Where the state is weak, corrupt, feared, or absent, somebody else steps into the space. Sometimes that somebody calls himself a protector. Sometimes he calls himself a businessman. Sometimes he's simply a criminal with enough friends to make resistance dangerous. Hell's Kitchen produced gangs because the conditions were ready for gangs. The streets offered recruits. The rail yards and docks offered things to steal. The saloons offered meeting places. The police offered both pressure and opportunity, because a corrupt officer could be bought, a brutal officer could make the neighbourhood close ranks, and an honest officer could still be outnumbered by a district that knew every alley better than he did. Before the famous gangs became organised enough to enter the mythology of New York crime, the ingredients were already there. Crowding, industry, immigration, prejudice, irregular work, alcohol, masculine pride, political machines, cheap weapons, bad housing. Children left to grow up in the street because the rooms upstairs were too crowded and the adults were too busy surviving. None of this excuses what came later. It explains the soil. And if there is one thing history teaches over and over again, it is that dangerous reputations do not grow from nothing. They grow where neglect has been given time. The city did notice Hell's Kitchen, but noticing is not the same as caring. Reformers noticed when conditions became shocking enough. Police noticed when bodies fell or newspapers complained. Politicians noticed when votes could be organised or favours traded. Landlords noticed when rents were due. Employers noticed when ships needed unloading or rails needed work. But the slow daily life of the neighbourhood, the sickness, the fear, the child standing barefoot in a hallway that smelled of coal smoke and cabbage and damp plaster, that was not an emergency in the eyes of the city. It was normal. And normal is where a great deal of suffering hides. This is why the story of Hell's Kitchen is not simply a march toward gangster glamour. In fact, if we tell it honestly, there is very little glamour in it. A saloon fight may sound colourful from a distance. It is less colourful when you remember the wife waiting upstairs for a husband who spent his wages before he came home. A street gang may sound almost theatrical when its members have nicknames that seem invented for a newspaper column. It is less theatrical when you remember the frightened witness who will not testify, because everyone knows where he lives. A neighbourhood may become famous for being dangerous, but fame does nothing for the mother trying to keep her children away from the corner where the older boys gather. That is the part I want us to keep returning to. Behind every notorious block were ordinary evenings. Behind every crime story were people trying to live around the danger, making small calculations every day. Which route is safest after dark? Is it better to send the child to the store now, or wait until morning? Should the rent be paid before buying coal? Is that shouting in the street something to ignore, or something close enough to matter? We're used to thinking of danger as an event, a sudden thing, a gunshot, a riot, a murder, a gang fight. But for people living inside Hell's Kitchen, danger was also an atmosphere. It was knowing what not to say. It was recognising footsteps. It was understanding that some men had to be greeted carefully. It was the way a whole block could become quiet when trouble turned the corner. And yet people stayed. Because people stay where work is, where family is, where rent is just barely possible, where church is near, where friends are known, where leaving requires money they do not have. That is another thing we should sit with for a moment. Outsiders often ask why people do not simply leave dangerous places. History answers with a tired look. Leave with what money? Go where? Work for whom? Be welcomed by whom? The poor do not experience geography the way the comfortable do. Moving is not just a decision. It is a cost. So Hell's Kitchen filled and hardened. The West Side kept pulling in labour and spitting out exhaustion. The tenements rose. The riverfront grew busier. The industrial yards made the neighbourhood necessary while also helping make it miserable. And over time, boys who had watched street power closely became men who organised it. Small groups became gangs. Gangs became names. Names became legends. The Gophers would come. Battle Row would become a phrase spoken with a mix of dread and fascination. Saloons would become offices for criminal business. The city would learn that these blocks did not behave like ordinary blocks. But before we meet the men with the nicknames, before we walk into the saloons, before we follow the rail line and the docks and the dark economy that grew beside them, we have to understand the ground under their feet. We have to understand the older West Side, the one before the label fully hardened, when this land was still becoming the place everyone would later claim had always been rough. Because Hell's Kitchen did not become New York's most dangerous neighbourhood in a single night. It became dangerous the way a fire catches in a crowded building. First there is heat, then smoke, then a flame in one room, then another, and by the time people in better neighbourhoods smell something burning, the people inside have been breathing it for years. Before anyone called this place Hell's Kitchen, before the newspapers learned to enjoy the sound of that name, before policemen spoke about these blocks with caution, and before gangs treated them like inherited property, the western side of Manhattan was quiet in a way that is difficult to imagine now. Not silent, because no inhabited place is ever truly silent. There was wind from the Hudson, birds near the marshy ground, insects in the warm months, carts moving on rough roads, and the ordinary sounds of people working land that had not yet disappeared beneath brick and rail. But it was quiet compared with what came later. It was not yet the hard, crowded neighbourhood of docks, slaughterhouses, gas tanks, freight trains, saloons, and tenements. It was not yet a place where boys grew up learning the map of danger before they learned much else. It was land beside the river, and for a long time that was the most important fact about it. Long before the city reached this far north with its full weight, this part of Manhattan belonged to a different geography. The island was not the flattened, gridded surface we know now. It had hills, rocky outcrops, small streams, low wet ground, patches of woodland and open fields. Water moved through it in ways modern New York has mostly buried, redirected, forgotten, or paved over. Near what would later be 10th Avenue and 40th Street, several small streams joined to form a watercourse known as the Great Kill, a Dutch word meaning creek. It wound through low land and emptied into the Hudson around the place where 42nd Street now reaches toward the river. Today, that sounds almost impossible. It is hard to stand near the Port Authority bus terminal or walk west through the noise of midtown traffic and picture a creek moving through that landscape, carrying fish, drawing birds, collecting runoff from ground that had not yet become a city floor. But the old stream was there, and streams matter. They shape settlement. They shape roads. They shape where animals gather, where people cross, where land feels useful or troublesome. Before Hell's Kitchen had a reputation, it had water. The Dutch and later English settlers who moved through this part of Manhattan saw land that could be farmed, parcelled, owned, worked, inherited and sold. They did not see a future slum. Nobody standing near the river in the 1700s would have looked around and imagined a neighbourhood that one day became shorthand for danger. That is one of the strange things about urban history. The future does not announce itself honestly. A field does not tell you it will become a tenement block. A lane does not tell you it will become a street where freight trains kill pedestrians. A farmhouse does not tell you that someday its old property lines will be lost under warehouses, apartment buildings, and asphalt. People live inside the present. They name things according to what they see. And what many people saw along this western side of Manhattan was a place of farms, country houses, work roads, and river access. The broader west side above the crowded lower city was often associated with Bloomingdale, a name connected with older Dutch descriptions of flowering or blooming land. That name can sound too pretty if we are not careful. It makes the place feel like a painting, and real farms were not paintings. They were labour. They were manure, mud, fences, tools, carts, smoke, milk, hay, kitchen gardens, and families trying to make property produce enough to justify itself. But compared with the later industrial district, Bloomingdale really was a softer world. There were estates and scattered homes. There were fields that opened toward the river. Wealthier New Yorkers sometimes kept country places along the west side because the air was cleaner than downtown, the land was higher in places, and the distance from the crowded commercial city made it feel almost separate. The island was already valuable, but it had not yet become the continuous machine it would become in the 19th century. One of the major farms in the area belonged to the Hopper family. Their property stretched across a large portion of what would later become the northern part of Hell's Kitchen, from near present-day 48th Street up toward 59th Street, and from the Hudson eastward across land that would eventually be cut into numbered avenues. Try to picture that for a moment without dressing it up too much. There is a farmhouse, outbuildings, cultivated land, lanes, fences, animals, and the river not far away. There are seasons that actually change the work. Spring mud, summer heat, autumn harvest, winter fuel. A family living there would have known the ground by use, not by street number. They would have known which low place held water too long after rain, which trees marked a boundary, which path to take toward the river, which neighbour could be asked for help, which section of road was worst after thaw. In the modern city, we know blocks by addresses. In a farm landscape, people know land by habit. A farmhouse connected with the Hopper family was built in the 1750s, near what is now 53rd Street and 11th Avenue. It later became known as Rosevale, a name that feels almost unreal when placed beside the future reputation of the neighbourhood, Rosevale. It sounds like a place with curtains moving in clean air, a place where someone took pride in gardens, a place where a family expected continuity. And in fact, the house lasted far longer than the rural world around it. It survived into the late 19th century, long enough to become a leftover from another age, standing while the city that had swallowed its surroundings became louder, harder, and less patient. I always find those survivals moving. Not because the houses themselves are noble in some dramatic sense, but because they show how uneven change really is. A city does not transform all at once. For decades, old and new sit beside each other awkwardly. A farmhouse remains while streets close in. A garden exists while rail lines come nearer. A family name stays attached to land that no longer looks like the thing the family once owned. There were other old properties too, including land connected to families such as the Motts, with houses near the river that survived into the late 1800s before disappearing. These details are easy to pass over, but they matter because they remind us that Hell's Kitchen was not always a crowded beginning. Its danger was not ancient. It was made. It emerged from the collision between land, labour, migration, money and neglect. If you erase the quiet beginning, you make the later violence seem natural, as if the place had always been destined for it. But nothing about the old farmland required the gophers, the Westies, the saloons or the knife fights. Those came from later conditions. The land itself was only land. The Hudson River gave the western side of Manhattan both beauty and risk. In the 1700s and early 1800s, the river was not a leisure view in the way many people experience it now. It was transportation, it was work, it was trade, it was weather. It was ice in winter, fog in certain seasons, difficult crossings, ferries, boats, goods, animals, fish and accidents. A family near the river lived with its usefulness and its danger. The river could connect you to markets and movement, but it could also make the land beside it attractive to the very industries that polite neighbourhoods did not want too close. That part comes later, but the seed is already present. The river made the land valuable in a particular way. Not valuable for quiet forever. Valuable because things could be moved. Manhattan's future was also being drawn on paper before it fully existed on the ground. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 laid the famous grid over much of the island, projecting streets and avenues northward through farms, hills, streams, and older property lines. This is one of those moments in New York history that can sound administrative until you really sit with it. A map can be an act of force. A line drawn across a farm may not change the soil that day, but it changes the future of the soil. It tells buyers, builders, speculators, and officials that the land is waiting to become something else. The people who drew the grid were not thinking about Hell's Kitchen as a future neighbourhood of gangs. They were thinking about growth, order, commerce, property, circulation, and the expansion of the city. Still, once the grid existed, the old landscape was living on borrowed time. Streets would arrive, lots would be divided. The city would move north and west in stages, sometimes slowly, sometimes with sudden force. In those early decades, the west side was still awkwardly connected to the city below. Roads mattered enormously. Bloomingdale Road ran northward and served the west side long before the modern avenues became what they are now. Smaller lanes connected farms and estates. Some paths were practical rather than elegant. They existed because someone needed to bring goods somewhere, drive animals somewhere, visit someone, reach the river, or reach the city. We sometimes imagine old roads romantically, but many were rough, muddy, rutted, unpleasant in bad weather, and tiring for animals and people alike. A simple trip could become work. Distance within Manhattan felt larger before smooth pavement, transit, and the constant compression of modern city life. Then there was 42nd Street, not yet the bright crosstown corridor people know today, but a route pushed westward toward the Hudson. In the 1820s, the city acquired a right-of-way through farmland to open 42nd Street to the river. That sounds like a small municipal action, but it tells you what was happening. The old private landscape was being made passable for the public city. Land that had been held in large tracts was being cut by public streets. The river edge was being tied more directly to the growing urban system. Soon enough, animals ferried across from New Jersey could be driven through the area towards slaughterhouses elsewhere in Manhattan. That detail is not pretty, but it is important. Before the neighbourhood became famous for human violence, it was already part of a working city that moved animals, food, waste, and labour through its streets. The roughness began with usefulness. This is where the story starts to change in tone, even before the worst of it arrives. A rural edge can survive for a while beside a growing city, but it cannot remain untouched when the city needs space for things it does not want downtown. New York was growing rapidly. Population rose. Commerce expanded. The waterfront became more important. The city needed lumber, coal, meat, storage, transportation, and cheap labour. These needs do not distribute themselves gently. They settle where land is available, where political resistance is weaker, where the poor can be housed close to work, and where unpleasant smells and sounds can be treated as someone else's problem. The western side of Manhattan was well positioned for that role. It was close to the Hudson, far enough from the most fashionable centres, and increasingly reachable as streets and transport improved. I want to pause on that phrase, someone else's problem, because it explains so much about the making of dangerous neighbourhoods. Slums are rarely accidental in the simple sense. They are often the result of many people making practical decisions that push hardship away from themselves. A wealthy person does not want a slaughterhouse near his home. A business owner wants cheap land near transportation. A landlord wants maximum rent from minimum construction. A city wants industrial growth without paying the full human cost of it. None of these choices alone creates Hell's Kitchen. Together, repeated over years, they create a place where life becomes harder than it needed to be. Then outsiders look at the people living there and call them rough, as if roughness were a personal defect instead of a condition produced by the city around them. The quiet land beside the Hudson began to lose its quiet in stages. First came more traffic, more subdivision, more buildings, more demand. The old farms were sold, divided, and transformed. Speculators saw opportunity in land that had once been family property. Streets opened through former fields. The riverfront drew businesses that needed shipping access and space. Houses appeared where there had been gardens. Workshops and yards appeared where there had been open ground. It did not happen evenly, and for years the area would have looked unfinished, half rural and half urban, a place where muddy lots sat near new structures, where old houses remained beside new enterprises, where the street grid existed in intention before it fully existed in daily reality. Those transitional landscapes are often messy. They attract people who can tolerate mess because they have little choice, and businesses that benefit from the lack of polish. Imagine walking west in the years before the neighbourhood's worst reputation had fully formed. You might pass remnants of older country life, then a yard full of materials, then a modest house, then open land, then a business using the river. The streets are not yet lined with the dense tenements that will come later, but the direction is clear. The city is coming. You can feel it in the roads, in the lots, in the talk of development, in the movement of goods. You can feel it in the way land stops being known as a place and starts being known as a future investment. For people with money, this transformation could mean profit. For people without money, it would eventually mean rent, crowding, and dependence on whatever work the new district offered. The arrival of rail made the transformation sharper. The Hudson River Railroad began service in the mid-19th century, and its line along the west side helped bind the riverfront more tightly to the economy of the city and the state beyond it. Railroads are often discussed as symbols of progress, and they were progress in many ways. They moved goods faster, they connected markets, they changed time, business, food supply, travel, and expansion. But progress always lands somewhere. In this case, it landed partly on the west side in the form of tracks, freight, noise, danger, and a new industrial intensity. The old quiet was not just disturbed, it was reorganised. Land near the tracks became useful for warehouses, yards, and factories. Men were needed to load, unload, build, repair, carry, shovel, and move. Families followed the work, cheap rooms followed the families, and with that, the future Hell's Kitchen began taking shape in a way that could not easily be undone. It is worth remembering that the railroad did not enter an empty moral landscape. It entered a city already divided by class, ethnicity, religion, and power. Poor immigrants, especially the Irish who arrived in great numbers during and after the famine years, would soon become central to the district's life. But before we step fully into their world, before we crowd the rooms and fill the streets, we need to see the stage being built. A neighbourhood is not only its people, it is also the arrangement of work and housing around them. If the work is dangerous, the pay irregular, the housing cheap and overcrowded, the streets poorly controlled, and the rest of the city contemptuous, then the people who arrive there inherit more than an address. They inherit a struggle. The older West Side gave way because New York needed it to give way. That is the practical truth. The city was growing too quickly to leave useful waterfront land in a semi-rural state. Farms and estates could not compete forever with freight, lots, docks, tracks, and population pressure. The houses that had once looked toward open ground became relics. Streams were buried or forgotten. The name Bloomingdale drifted elsewhere, surviving more as memory than daily description. The great kill disappeared beneath the city's surface. The land that once held waterfowl, gardens, and farm lanes became part of a harder geography. It was still the same physical island, but its purpose had changed. There is something unsettling about how little time it takes for a place to lose its older identity. A family can live on land for generations, and then, within 1 or 2 lifetimes, nearly every visible trace of that life is gone. Not because the people were unimportant, but because cities are very good at burying what they no longer need. A farmhouse becomes an obstacle. A stream becomes a drainage problem. A hill becomes fill. A garden becomes a lot. A lane becomes a street or vanishes completely. By the time later residents of Hell's Kitchen fought, worked, drank, prayed, raised children, and buried their dead there, many of them may have had little sense of the earlier quiet beneath their feet. Why would they? They had rent to pay. The past does not announce itself when the present is loud enough. And the present was getting louder. The rail line was only one part of it. Industry gathered around the riverfront because the river made industry easier. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, lumberyards, stables, breweries and warehouses did not arrive because the neighbourhood was already dangerous. They arrived because the location served their needs. But once they arrived, they helped determine what kind of neighbourhood could grow there. These businesses brought odours, waste, animals, heavy traffic, irregular employment, and a population of workers who needed to live near the source of wages. Respectable residential development had little reason to choose such surroundings when cleaner, quieter districts were available. So the West Side began settling into a role. It would be useful rather than elegant, necessary rather than admired, worked rather than cared for. That distinction matters. A neighbourhood can be essential to a city and still be neglected by it. In fact, that combination appears again and again in history. The places that unload the ships, store the goods, process the meat, house the labourers and absorb the smoke are often treated as if their suffering is the cost of everyone else's convenience. Hell's Kitchen was moving toward that role. It would help feed and supply New York while being blamed for the very roughness that such work produced. The men who laboured there would be called crude. The women who kept households together there would be called poor. The children who played in its streets would be called wild. But the city needed their district. That is the part polite New York preferred not to say too loudly. By the time the name Hell's Kitchen began to attach itself to the area later in the 19th century, the older landscape was already mostly gone from daily experience. The name did not create the conditions. It described, exaggerated, and marketed them. Before the name, there had been farms, streams, riverwork, roads, families, property lines, country houses, and gradual development. Then came the machinery of the city, the grid, the railroad, the docks, the industrial yards, the cheap buildings, the pressure of migration. The quiet land beside the Hudson did not suddenly turn wicked. It was used hard, and then it was crowded by people who had very little room to refuse what the city demanded of them. So when we move forward from this older world into the tenements and immigrant streets, we should carry the quiet with us for a little while. Not because the quiet was innocent in some perfect way, and not because farmland is automatically kinder than city life. Farms had their own hardships, their own inequalities, their own forms of labour and ownership. But the contrast helps us understand the scale of the change. The future Hell's Kitchen was not always a warning. It was once a western edge of Manhattan where water moved through low ground, where farm families knew the seasons, where old houses stood with names like Rosevale, where the Hudson was close and useful, and where the city had not yet pressed every block into service. Then the city arrived with its plans, its tracks, its appetite, and its need for workers. And once workers came in large numbers, especially the hungry and exhausted families arriving from Ireland and other parts of Europe, the story narrowed from land to survival, from property to rent, from open fields to rooms crowded enough that the street itself became the real living space for thousands of children who would learn very early what kind of neighbourhood they had been born into. By the time immigrant families began filling the western blocks of Midtown in large numbers, the old quiet along the Hudson had already started to give way. The farms were being broken into lots. Streets were being opened where fields and lanes had once made sense only to the people who worked them. The railroad had brought a harder rhythm to the west side, and the river, which had once been useful in a slower, older way, was becoming part of a much larger machine. Ships came in, freight had to be moved, animals had to be driven, coal had to be unloaded, lumber had to be stacked. Barrels, crates, ropes, iron, grain, hides, bricks and machinery all passed through the neighbourhood in one form or another, and every one of those things required hands. Strong hands, cheap hands, hands belonging to men who could be hired by the day and dismissed by nightfall. That is where the story of the streets really begins to change, because the West Side did not simply attract industry. It attracted the people who had almost no choice but to live beside it. Most of them did not arrive imagining danger. That is worth remembering. A family coming into New York Harbor in the middle of the 19th century did not look north toward Manhattan and think, "We will go help create one of the most feared neighborhoods in the city." They thought about food, wages, shelter, relatives, church, work, and the possibility of not being hungry anymore. Many Irish immigrants who came during and after the famine years had already survived a disaster before they ever reached the West Side. They had seen hunger do things to families that no person forgets. They had left behind places where the future had narrowed so badly that a crowded ship to America seemed less like an adventure than a last door left open. And when they arrived in New York, they entered a city that needed them immediately and resented them almost as quickly. New York wanted their labour. It did not always want their presence. That contradiction sat at the centre of the immigrant life in places like Hell's Kitchen. The work available to poor newcomers on the West Side was not gentle work. It was the work of the riverfront and the rail yards, the kind that did not require a polished education or social connections, but did require a body that could absorb punishment. A man might unload cargo from a ship in weather that made his hands stiff and raw. He might work around animals bound for slaughter, breathing in the smells of blood, manure, wet straw, and fear. He might stack lumber until his shoulders ached in a way that sleep did not fully fix. He might shovel coal, lift freight, repair track, push carts, drive teams, or wait outside a hiring place hoping someone with authority would point at him instead of the man beside him. There was humiliation in that waiting. The whole morning could turn on another man's nod. If he was chosen, there might be wages. If not, there was the long walk back through streets where his family would know from his face that the day had gone badly. This kind of irregular work shaped the neighbourhood more deeply than people usually realise. A steady wage allows a family to plan. A day wage forces a family to guess. Rent still comes due when a man is not hired. Children still need food when an injury keeps him from lifting. Coal still costs money in winter when the docks are slow or another man gets the job, so the household itself becomes a small economy under pressure. The mother stretches food. A child sells papers or runs errands. A boarder is taken in even when there is not really room for one more body. A daughter may go into service. A son may start spending more time in the street than any parent intended. And the street, in a district like this, was not empty space. It was a school. The tenements that housed these families were not built around comfort. They were built around rent. That sentence explains a great deal about New York in the 19th century. A tenement was not simply a poor person's apartment building. It was a financial instrument made of brick, wood, plaster, airlessness, and human density. The more people a landlord could fit into a structure, the more money the building could produce. Light did not pay rent. Fresh air did not pay rent. A hallway wide enough for decency did not pay rent. So buildings went up narrow, deep, and dark, squeezed onto lots in ways that made sense on a ledger, and very little sense to a child trying to breathe through a summer night. Rooms were divided and subdivided. Families lived in spaces that had not been designed for the number of bodies inside them. Boarders slept where boarders could be placed. Privacy became a luxury so rare that many children grew up barely understanding it. Imagine one of those rooms in the evening. Not as a stage set, not as a museum room with everything arranged neatly for visitors, but as a real place after a real day. There is a bed, maybe more than one, perhaps a mattress on the floor, perhaps a cradle if there is a baby. There are clothes hung where clothes can be hung, because closets are not something this family can depend on. There is a stove or access to one, depending on the building and the arrangement. There are cooking smells, damp wool, smoke, sweat, stale bedding, and the odour of the hallway coming in whenever the door opens. Someone is coughing. Someone is trying to sleep before a night shift or after work that began too early. A child needs to be quiet but cannot. A boarder, not related by blood but necessary for rent, takes up space that everyone resents and everyone needs. The mother knows exactly how many coins are in the household and exactly how many days they must last. The father, if he is present, is tired in a way that makes tenderness harder. No one in that room is thinking about future legends of Hell's Kitchen. They are thinking about tomorrow. The buildings themselves could make tomorrow harder. Ventilation was poor, sanitation was worse, water might have to be carried. Toilets, when available, were often shared by many people, and before reforms forced improvements, privies could be filthy, inadequate, and dangerous to health. Garbage did not politely disappear. It collected, it rotted, it drew animals. In summer, heat turned cramped rooms into traps. In winter, cold moved through weak walls and windows, while fuel cost money and money was never guaranteed. Fire was an ever-present fear, because crowded buildings full of wooden stairs, stoves, lamps, and hurried people could become deadly very quickly. Disease moved easily where people were packed together and children shared air, bedding, stairwells, water sources, and bad drainage. We sometimes describe tenement life as if it was only uncomfortable. It was more than uncomfortable. It was a condition that pressed on the body until the body had very little peace left. And then, when the room became too crowded, the children went outside. This was one of the most important facts of tenement neighbourhoods, and one of the easiest to overlook. The street was not just a route from one place to another. It was an extension of the home. It was where children played because there was no room upstairs. It was where boys learned from older boys. It was where girls watched adults negotiate, shop, argue, carry, wash, sell, borrow and endure. It was where news travelled. It was where reputations formed. It was where a family's private troubles could become public within minutes. If a father was drunk, the street knew. If rent was overdue, the street might know. If a boy stole, fought, cried, lied, or showed fear, the street remembered. In a place with little privacy, reputation became a kind of currency, and for boys especially, fearlessness could seem more useful than obedience. Here is something that can be hard to sit with. Many of the boys who later became the rough young men of Hell's Kitchen were not born into a world that rewarded gentleness. That does not mean they had no tenderness in them. It does not mean they did not love their mothers, protect younger siblings, feed stray animals, laugh at jokes, or feel shame. It means the public life of the street taught them that weakness was expensive. A boy who could be pushed aside might be pushed aside again. A boy who cried too easily might be marked. A boy who could not defend himself might lose food, wages, errands, dignity, or safety. So boys learn to stand a certain way, speak a certain way, look at strangers a certain way. They learned who controlled which corner, which older boys were dangerous, which saloons had trouble outside them, which policemen hit first and asked questions later, which men could get someone hired, which men could get someone hurt. This was education without a classroom. The immigrant street also had its protections. We should not imagine only misery. That would be false, and it would flatten people who lived full lives under hard conditions. The Irish families of the West Side built communities. They formed friendships, married neighbours, worshipped together, kept wakes, celebrated baptisms, helped one another find work and shared small forms of assistance that rarely appear in official records. A woman might borrow a little flour from someone upstairs. A neighbour might watch children while another went looking for work. A parish might provide structure, identity and moral order in a city that often treated Catholic immigrants with suspicion. A saloon could be destructive, yes, but it could also be a hiring hall, political office, message centre, temporary bank, and warm room for men with nowhere else to sit. The same institution could ruin a household and keep another man connected to work. History is rarely neat enough to let us label everything one thing. Still, the pressures were relentless. Anti-Irish prejudice was real and open. Irish immigrants were often described in ugly language by people who considered them disorderly, ignorant, drunken, Catholic, politically dangerous and racially inferior by the standards of the time. Signs that allegedly read "No Irish Need Apply" became part of the wider memory of discrimination, whether in every case literal or symbolic, because the feeling behind the phrase was widely understood. To be poor and Irish in 19th century New York was to know that many people expected little from you except labour and trouble. That expectation could become a cage. When respectable society insists that a group is naturally rough, it should not act surprised when some young men decide that roughness is the only identity that brings them respect. Politics entered the tenement world through necessity. The political machine, most famously Tammany Hall, understood poor immigrant neighbourhoods in ways reformers often did not. Reformers might bring lectures. The machine brought coal, jobs, legal help, funeral money, a turkey at the holidays, or a word with the right official. Was it corrupt? Yes, often. Was it transactional? Absolutely. But it also operated where formal systems failed or ignored people. A family facing eviction did not always have the luxury of judging help by moral purity. If a ward boss could delay trouble, secure employment, or solve a problem, loyalty followed. This mattered for Hell's Kitchen because political protection and street power often overlapped. The same saloon that connected men to work might also connect them to gambling, intimidation, vote-getting, and gang loyalty. The boundaries between neighbourhood service, political corruption, and criminal opportunity could be very thin. Alcohol was everywhere in this landscape, and not only because people lacked discipline, which is the easy explanation, and usually the lazy one. Saloons offered heat, light, company, credit, information, and escape. For men who lived in crowded rooms, the saloon could feel like the only place where they had space to be adult men among other men. It could also drain wages, fuel violence, and turn already strained households into desperate ones. A wife waiting upstairs for rent money had every reason to hate the saloon. A husband who felt humiliated all day by bosses, hiring agents, and poverty might feel, inside that saloon, temporarily restored. There is the tragedy. The place that comforted him could help destroy the home he was trying to support. The streets around those saloons became stages where insult and pride had consequences. In a cramped neighbourhood, small disputes could become public quickly. A shove outside a doorway, a comment about a man's wife. A fight between boys from different blocks, a disagreement over a borrowed tool or unpaid debt, a quarrel after drinking, a challenge that could not be ignored without losing face. Modern life has its own humiliations, but many of them are private or digital or softened by distance. In Hell's Kitchen, humiliation happened at arm's length. People saw it. People remembered. And if a man or boy did not answer it, the silence itself might become part of his reputation. That is how violence becomes social, not just personal. It becomes a language people use because everyone around them understands it. Women carried a different part of this burden. Their danger was often less visible in the stories later told about the neighbourhood, because reporters and historians preferred gangs, riots, and murders. But the women in tenement households lived with danger in more continuous ways. They managed hunger, illness, pregnancy, childbirth, washing, cooking, rent, children, drunkenness, grief, and the constant invasion of noise from the street. A woman might climb several flights of stairs with water or coal. She might take in laundry, sewing, borders, or piecework to make rent possible. She might stretch soup until it became almost symbolic. She might keep children inside when trouble was close, or send them out because the room was unbearable. She might know exactly which men downstairs not to anger, which neighbour was safe, which shopkeeper might extend credit, which doctor was too expensive, which priest might help. The neighbourhood's danger entered her life not as legend, but as calculation. The children absorbed all of this. They absorbed the sound of quarrels through walls, the rhythm of boots on stairs, the warning in a mother's voice when she said, "Not that way tonight, go around." They learned which smells meant dinner and which meant sickness. They learned the difference between ordinary shouting and dangerous shouting. They learned when adults were pretending not to be afraid. And because children adapt to the world they are given, much of this became normal. That is one of the saddest truths about hard places. A child can grow used to almost anything if it repeats often enough. He can grow used to crowding, hunger, smoke, rats, drunken men, police raids, fights, funerals, and the sudden silence after a window breaks. He can grow used to seeing adults lower their voices when certain names are mentioned. Later, outsiders will call him hard. They may never ask what hardened him. By the late 19th century, tenement districts across New York had become subjects of reform, investigation, photography, journalism, and public alarm. But alarm did not always mean understanding. Reformers often saw filth and vice. They did not always see systems. They saw dirty children without always seeing the rent that forced families into rooms too small for decency. They saw drunken men without always seeing casual labour, injury and humiliation. They saw crowded buildings without always seeing the landlords who profited from crowding. They saw immigrant neighbourhoods as problems to be corrected, and sometimes they were right about the need for correction, but they were not always humble enough to understand the people living there as fully human. Hell's Kitchen, with its rough streets and worsening reputation, gave reformers plenty to look at. It also gave them plenty to misunderstand. The law began to respond slowly and imperfectly. Regulations tried to address air, light, fire escapes, privies, drainage, and overcrowding. But laws written on paper did not instantly change buildings already standing, landlords already collecting rent, inspectors already underpaid or corruptible, and families already desperate for any room they could afford. A new rule could say a building needed better ventilation. It could not immediately give a mother fresh air for a feverish child in August. It could require a fire escape and still leave the daily fear of fire intact. Reform mattered, but reform was slow, and poverty lived fast. Every day before improvement arrived was still a day people had to survive. Hell's Kitchen's particular geography made the street even more important. It was close to the river, but separated from more fashionable Manhattan by both distance and perception. The blocks west of 8th Avenue felt, to many New Yorkers, like another city attached to the city. The avenues carried labour traffic, carts, animals, and later trains. The side streets held residences, saloons, small shops and gathering places where a neighbourhood identity hardened block by block. People did not simply belong to Hell's Kitchen in the broad sense. They belonged to a particular street, a particular corner, a particular group of families, a particular parish, a particular saloon orbit. In crowded urban life, loyalty often shrinks to the scale at which protection is possible. The city may be too large to trust. The neighbourhood may be too rough to trust. But the block, the family, the gang of boys you grew up with, those may feel real. This is how the conditions of immigrant life began feeding the conditions of street power. A group of boys who started by playing together could become a group that defended a corner. A group that defended a corner could become a group that stole from outsiders. A group that stole from outsiders could become useful to an older man with political or criminal connections. A neighbourhood that distrusted police might protect its own young toughs, even when those toughs frightened their neighbours, because outsiders were feared more. A saloon owner might tolerate them because they brought business or kept rivals away. A politician might find them useful on election day. A policeman might crack down one week and accept money the next. These relationships grew not from a master plan but from daily contact. Hell's Kitchen was not organised all at once. It organised itself around pressure. There is something almost painful about how ordinary the beginnings of danger can be. We expect a dramatic turning point, a famous murder, a riot, a single leader, a night when everything changes. Sometimes those moments matter, but more often a neighbourhood becomes dangerous through repetition. A child sees a fight and remembers who won. A man gets away with theft and learns the risk was worth it. A landlord ignores complaints and learns no one will stop him. A policeman beats someone and learns the neighbourhood will not trust him. A boy joins older boys and discovers that fear in other people's eyes feels better than fear in his own chest. A mother tells her daughter not to walk past a certain saloon, and the warning becomes part of the map. Repeat that for years, and danger becomes not an event, but an expectation. And yet, every evening, life continued. This is the part that matters if we are going to tell the story honestly. In the same streets where boys fought, women bought bread. In the same buildings where disease spread, babies were rocked to sleep. In the same saloons where wages vanished, men heard news from home, found work, and spoke Irish memories into American air. Children played games in alleys, shouted, laughed, scraped knees, and learned songs. Families went to mass. Neighbours sat on stoops in summer because the rooms upstairs were too hot to bear. Someone carried soup to a sick woman. Someone pawned a coat. Someone came home with a black eye and lied about it. Someone got hired. Someone did not. The neighbourhood was frightening, but it was also home, and that is why the story cannot be reduced to crime. The streets had no mercy because the conditions had no mercy. That is the simplest way to say it. A street does not care if a child is tired. Rent does not care if work was scarce. A landlord does not care if a room is overcrowded as long as the money arrives. A hiring boss does not care how many men go home without wages. A disease does not care whether a mother has already buried one child. A gang does not care if a shopkeeper is barely surviving when it demands payment or loyalty. Mercy existed in individuals, in mothers, neighbours, priests, friends, and sometimes even in the rough men who could be cruel one hour and generous the next. But the system around them was not merciful. It squeezed people and then judged the shapes they took under pressure. By the time Hell's Kitchen became notorious, outsiders saw the hard faces, the fights, the drinking, the gangs, the murders, and the rough boys who seemed to belong to the pavement itself. What they did not always see was the long preparation, the immigrant ships, the hunger behind them, the tenement rooms, the day labour, the hostile city, the crowded streets, the mothers counting coins, the fathers waiting to be hired, the children learning danger as a second language. The neighbourhood's violence was real. It should not be softened into romance. People were hurt there. People were frightened there. People were trapped there. But if we want to understand how Hell's Kitchen became one of New York's most dangerous neighbourhoods, we have to begin with the people who arrived looking for shelter and found themselves living in a place where shelter itself could feel like another kind of struggle. The old land beside the Hudson had become a human furnace of work, want, and crowding. The quiet creek was gone. The farms were gone. The river remained, but now it carried the weight of industry. The tenements rose close to the places where men might earn just enough to keep their families indoors for another month. And downstairs, below those rooms, the streets took on a life of their own. They were playground, marketplace, courtroom, schoolyard, hiring hall, battlefield, and theatre. They taught quickly and punished slowly. They gave some children confidence and others fear. They made neighbourhood loyalty feel necessary, and once loyalty becomes necessary, the gang is never very far away. The boys were already watching. The saloons were already filling. The corners were already being claimed. Before the famous names appeared, before Battle Row entered the story, before the Gophers and their rivals made the West Side a place the rest of New York spoke about with dread, the streets had already done their work. The streets had already done their work, but the city was not finished shaping them. It is one thing to crowd a neighbourhood with families who have too little money and too little room. It is another thing to run the machinery of a growing metropolis through the middle of their daily lives. That is what happened on the West Side. Hell's Kitchen was not only poor, it was industrial, and that word industrial can sound clean if we leave it alone on the page. It can sound like brick buildings, wages, progress, strong men, railroad schedules, ships coming in, the city rising. But on the ground, inside the blocks where people actually lived, industrial meant smoke. It meant noise. It meant horses slipping in filth. It meant freight trains moving through streets where children crossed. It meant the smell of animals before slaughter and the smell after. It meant coal dust settling on windowsills, damp wood stacked near the river, barrels leaking in the street, men coming home with their clothes carrying the day's labour into rooms already too small for comfort. If the tenements gave Hell's Kitchen its crowding, the railroads and docks gave it its pulse, and that pulse was not gentle. To understand this neighbourhood, you have to stop imagining industry as something separate from home. Today, most of us live with a distance between where we sleep and where heavy work happens. Factories are zoned away. Freight routes are hidden or fenced off. Meat arrives wrapped in plastic. Coal no longer tumbles into the daily imagination of city life the way it once did. But in the 19th century West Side, the systems that fed New York pressed right up against the places where families cooked, fought, slept, prayed, and tried to raise children. The neighbourhood did not wake to birdsong in the way the old farms once might have. It woke to the movement of goods. Before the sun had fully lifted, men were already headed toward the river, toward the yards, toward the tracks, toward the places where a foreman might choose them or ignore them. Horses stamped, wheels hit uneven street surfaces. Metal struck metal. A train bell sounded somewhere west of the tenements. The city was asking for labour again, and Hell's Kitchen was expected to provide it. The railroad changed the meaning of the West Side. Before the tracks, the Hudson River had already made the district useful, but rail made that usefulness faster, harder, and more dangerous. Freight could move in from the north and out toward the piers. Coal, dairy, beef, lumber, and manufactured goods entered the city's bloodstream through this western edge. The tracks ran at street level along the avenues, and that detail matters more than almost anything else. These were not trains separated safely above or below the life of the neighbourhood. They moved through the same space as wagons, pedestrians, pushcarts, horses, workers, and children. Imagine standing on an avenue where a freight train is not behind a fence, not in a distant rail yard, not heard only as a low sound far away, but coming directly through the public street. A person had to judge distance, speed, noise, and timing, while the ordinary business of life continued around them. A child with an errand, a woman crossing with a bundle, a cart driver trying to move a load, a labourer stepping out from between wagons. All of them shared space with machines much heavier than anything their bodies could survive. That is how the avenue earned its terrible nickname. Death Avenue was not a poetic exaggeration invented by someone looking for drama. It was a practical description of a place where trains and people met too often and too violently. The railroad eventually hired mounted men, remembered as West Side cowboys, who rode ahead of freight trains waving flags to warn people out of the way. Sit with that for a moment. Cowboys in Manhattan, not on an open plain, not under a wide western sky, but riding through crowded city streets ahead of industrial freight, trying to clear a path through a neighbourhood that had been forced to share its streets with danger. It would almost be funny if the reason for it were not so grim. A horseman waving a flag became part of the safety system because the basic arrangement itself was unsafe. The city had placed heavy rail traffic where people lived, and then asked men on horseback to make that arrangement less deadly. For the families nearby, this danger became part of the mental map of the neighbourhood. Do not cross there without looking. Do not let the little ones wander too far west. Listen for the bell. Watch the horseman. Keep clear of the tracks. These warnings would have entered childhood early. A modern parent worries about traffic, yes, but the traffic of Death Avenue carried a different kind of dread. A horse cart might injure, a freight train could erase, and because accidents repeated over years, the danger became familiar without becoming less frightening. That is one of the cruel things about life in a hazardous district. people grow used to what they should never have had to accept. They learn the rhythms, they tell themselves they can manage the risk, and most days they do. Then one day someone misjudges a crossing, or a child runs at the wrong moment, or a horse panics, or fog and noise confuse the senses, and the whole neighbourhood is reminded again of what has been passing through it all along. The tracks also change the work available to men in the area. Rail work could mean loading and unloading, track maintenance, freight handling, and all the rough labour surrounding the movement of goods. It was the kind of work that took strength and gave back injuries. A young man could begin with a strong back and quick hands, and within a few years carry pain that made him older than his age. The city did not lack replacements. Immigrant labour kept arriving, and when work is scarce enough, a damaged man is easily exchanged for a desperate one. This was not only an economic fact, it became a moral atmosphere. If your body was the only tool you owned, then every day's work was also a gamble with the future. A crushed hand, a twisted spine, a bad fall, a wagon accident, a fight at the hiring place, and suddenly a household that was barely surviving had lost the thing holding it up. The docks had their own rhythm and their own violence. The Hudson River piers drew men before dawn and kept them moving in weather that did not care about human comfort. Ships had to be unloaded when ships arrived. Cargo did not wait politely for a pleasant day. Rain made ropes slick. Winter made hands stiff. Summer made the air heavy with rot, sweat and river smell. Longshore work was irregular, competitive, and physically punishing. Men gathered hoping to be selected. The humiliation of being passed over was not private. Other men saw it. Your neighbours might know you had not been hired. Your wife would know when you came home without pay. Your children might understand from the silence at supper. In a neighbourhood already crowded with pride and worry, that kind of public uncertainty could sour the air between men. Competition for work did not stay at the docks. It followed men back into saloons, boarding rooms, tenement halls and street corners. A dock was also a place of opportunity in the illegal sense. Goods were everywhere, and goods have a way of tempting people who are hungry. A crate could be damaged, a barrel could be lightened, a small item could disappear. A watchman could be distracted, bribed or threatened. A boy running errands near the river might learn that the line between work and theft was sometimes only a matter of who saw what happened. This does not mean every labourer was stealing. Most men were working hard for too little money and trying to get home with enough pay to keep their families alive. But the environment itself created chances. Wherever freight moves, theft follows. Wherever theft follows, protection follows. Wherever protection follows, gangs find a reason to exist. The docks did not create the criminal world by themselves, but they gave it goods, hiding places, contacts, and a steady education in what could be taken. Then there were the slaughterhouses and the animal trades, which are almost impossible to understand unless we allow the smells into the story. Modern cities have hidden animal death from most people. Meat comes clean, cooled, packaged, and distant from the creature it once was. The 19th century city had no such distance. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and calves had to be moved, held, killed, cut, transported, and sold. Before refrigeration changed the entire food system, animals often needed to arrive alive or close enough to the point of sale that spoilage did not ruin the profit. New York's hunger for meat was enormous, and that hunger passed through working districts. The West Side, with its river access, rail connections, and rougher industrial character, became part of that system. Animals were driven through streets, penned in yards, brought near slaughter, and reduced from living bodies into food, hides, fat, bones, and waste. The smell would have been constant in certain places. Manure, blood, wet straw, animal fear, boiling fat, hides, offal, smoke, and river damp all mixing with coal dust and ordinary human crowding. If you lived nearby, you did not smell it once and then move on. You lived with it. It entered fabric. It clung to boots. It settled into the idea of home. Visitors might wrinkle their noses and describe the district as filthy, but the people who lived there had to build lives inside that filth. A woman washing clothes could not simply wash the neighbourhood out of them. A child playing outside could not avoid the street's residue. Men who worked around slaughter might bring home a smell that no amount of tired scrubbing fully removed. This is what survival smelled like. Not metaphorically, literally. Slaughterhouse work itself hardened people in ways outsiders rarely understood. It required speed, strength, and a tolerance for blood and bodily mess. It was skilled in its own way, but socially low in status, because polite people wanted meat without thinking too long about who made meat possible. The men who did such work saw the city from underneath. They knew the underside of appetite. They understood that comfort in one neighbourhood often depended on unpleasant labour in another. And because the work was dirty, dangerous, and badly regarded, it helped mark the district around it. A neighbourhood filled with the trades of necessity rarely gets called respectable. The more essential its labour, the more eager the rest of the city may be to look away from the people doing it. Coal yards and lumber yards added their own burdens. Coal was heat, power, cooking, transport, and industry. It was also dust, weight, and black residue. Men shovelled it, hauled it, stored it, sold it, and breathed it. The dust settled on skin and in lungs. It darkened cuffs, faces, walls, and windows. Lumber came with splinters, strain, and the constant hazard of stacked weight. Warehouses stored goods that made fortunes for people far from the neighbourhood, while the men handling those goods often remained one missed week from hunger. The west side became a corridor of usefulness, and usefulness made it crowded with everything wealthier neighbourhoods pushed away. It was not simply that Hell's Kitchen had rough people, it had rough work. Rough work creates rough routines. Rough routines create rough bodies. Rough bodies, tired and underpaid, carry tension into already crowded streets. There were sounds too, and they mattered. We often think about smell in industrial neighbourhoods, but sound is just as important. A tenement family near rail and dock work did not experience quiet as a right. Bells, whistles, hooves, wheels, shouts, chains, engines, carts, animals, and drunken voices at night all cut into the day. Noise reduces patience. Anyone who has lived beside constant traffic or construction knows this in a small way. Now imagine it without modern windows, without insulation, without noise ordinances, without a reliable way to escape indoors because indoors is also crowded and loud. A baby cannot sleep. A man working a night shift cannot rest properly by day. A mother trying to keep order in a room full of children has the street forcing itself through the walls. The neighbourhood's famous violence did not grow out of noise alone, of course, but noise wears people down. Exhaustion lowers the threshold for anger. So does heat, so does hunger, so does the knowledge that tomorrow will be much like today. The street itself became a workplace, not only for men with formal jobs, but for children, vendors, scavengers, petty traders, and people living at the edges of legality. Pushcarts moved food, rags, small goods, and household necessities. Boys carried messages, watched horses, sold newspapers, picked coal, hauled small loads, and learned which scraps had value. Girls might help with errands, younger siblings, laundry, selling, or piecework that tied them to the household economy before childhood had much time to breathe. Nothing in a poor industrial neighbourhood stayed purely domestic or purely commercial. The home needed the street because the room was too small and the income too fragile. The street needed the home because every family supplied labour, customers, gossip, and human density. This constant mixing made the neighbourhood intensely alive and deeply unstable. It is easy to imagine industrial labour as masculine, and much of the visible labour around docks, railroads, and slaughterhouses was done by men. But women paid the price of that labour every day. They washed the clothes that came back stiff with sweat, grease, coal, or animal residue. They stretched wages that might disappear in a saloon before reaching the kitchen. They nursed injuries when there was no money for proper care. They took in boarders when work slowed. They soothed children frightened by street noise or violence. They judged whether a husband's bad mood was exhaustion, drink, or something more dangerous. Their homes absorbed the industry outside. Every dirty shirt, every late wage, every injury, every smell, every fear entered the room where they were expected to maintain order. A factory or dock did not end at the workplace. It continued upstairs in the hands of the woman trying to make a household from what was left of a man after the city had used him. Men, too, were trapped inside expectations that did them harm. A man was supposed to provide. If he could not, shame followed. If he was injured, shame followed. If another man got work and he did not, resentment followed. The saloon offered a way to feel seen, but also a way to lose the wages the household needed. Street politics offered connection, but also obligation. Gang loyalty could begin as protection and become a debt. A rough reputation could help a man avoid humiliation, but it could also invite challenges. The neighbourhood gave men few soft places to put disappointment. So disappointment often came out sideways, in drinking, fighting, cruelty at home, reckless pride, or allegiance to stronger men who promised a kind of power the lawful city withheld. The dangerous reputation of Hell's Kitchen grew partly because industrial neighbourhoods create many points of conflict. Workers fought employers over wages, hours, hiring, and conditions. Men fought one another over work. Neighbours fought over noise, space, debts, and insult. Gangs fought over corners, saloons, docks, theft opportunities, and political usefulness. Police fought residents. Residents fought police. And sometimes both sides knew very well that law was not the only thing at stake. In a cleaner, wealthier neighbourhood, conflict might be managed by lawyers, property, private space, or influence. In Hell's Kitchen, conflict often happened in the open, where bodies were the most available instruments. This is not because the people there were somehow naturally more violent. It is because the neighbourhood's pressures pushed disputes into public space and gave people fewer peaceful ways to settle them. The riverfront also connected Hell's Kitchen to a wider criminal geography. A dock neighbourhood is never isolated. Sailors, labourers, passengers, freight handlers, gamblers, prostitutes, thieves, political fixers and policemen all move through it. Goods arrive from elsewhere and disappear into the city. Information travels with ships and workers. A man can hide for a while near the waterfront if enough people do not wish to see him. A stolen item can move quickly if there are buyers, fences, and routes. The river gives legitimate commerce a path, and illegitimate commerce learns to use the same path. By the time organised gangs became more formal, the infrastructure of opportunity was already waiting. The district had freight to steal, saloons to gather in, frightened residents to intimidate, politicians to serve, and enough distrust of authority to make silence easier than testimony. Still, there was pride in the work. That should not be forgotten. Men who laboured on the docks, rail lines, in yards and around warehouses were not only victims of industry, they had skills. They knew ropes, loads, weather, animals, tools, schedules, bosses, and the physical intelligence required to do dangerous tasks without getting killed. A man could take pride in strength, endurance, and competence. A boy watching his father or older brother work might see not only exhaustion but capability. The problem was not that the work had no dignity. The problem was that the city took the dignity of the work and returned too little security. Pride without security can become brittle. A proud man who is respected nowhere outside his own block may guard that block fiercely, even foolishly. A neighbourhood that knows it is despised by outsiders may turn inward and begin treating suspicion as wisdom. In the evenings, after the day's work moved back into the tenements, the industrial neighbourhood did not truly rest. Freight might still move, saloons filled, wagons returned, animals made noise in nearby yards. The smell of the river changed with tide and weather. Men compared wages, injuries, bosses, rumours and grievances. Children repeated what they had seen. Women measured the damage the day had done. Maybe there was enough money for food. Maybe not. Maybe a man came home sober. Maybe not. Maybe a boy who'd been hanging near the docks returned with coins and would not say how he got them. Maybe everyone knew, and nobody asked because the rent was due. This is how a neighbourhood's moral world becomes complicated. Hunger does not erase right and wrong, but it changes the cost of insisting on them. The official city saw the West Side as a place of work, transport and trouble. Reformers saw conditions, police saw disorder, employers saw labour, landlords saw rent, reporters saw copy, residents saw home. That last view matters most because it contains everything the others missed. To live in Hell's Kitchen was not to spend every hour thinking, I live in a notorious place. It was to know the price of coal, the mood of the block, the safest crossing, the worst saloon, the sound of a train, the smell before rain, the foreman's habits, the priest's patience, the landlord's threats, the neighbour who could be trusted with a child, and the family downstairs that had fallen on worse times than you. It was to live inside a web of knowledge built from necessity. The railroads, docks, slaughterhouses and yards did not simply surround the neighbourhood. They trained it. They trained its people to move quickly, to listen for danger, to judge men by strength and usefulness, to understand that money came irregularly and disappeared quickly, to expect the city to take more than it gave. They trained boys to admire toughness. They trained women to calculate constantly. They trained families to accept smells, sounds and risks that would have caused outrage elsewhere. They made the West Side essential, and then allowed outsiders to call it degraded, and in that insult, repeated in different forms for decades, you can hear one of the reasons the neighbourhood hardened. A place that knows it is despised may begin to make a weapon out of being feared. By the late 1800s, all of these forces were packed together west of the more polished city. The river still brought work, the rail line still brought danger, the yard still brought smells, the tenements still held more people than they should. The saloons still glowed at night with heat, drink, talk and trouble. And the streets between them became the neighbourhood's testing ground. A boy did not need to read a newspaper to know what power looked like. He saw it when a gang of older youths controlled a corner. He saw it when a saloon keeper spoke quietly and men listened. He saw it when a policeman walked in and people moved, or when people did not move because they knew whose protection mattered more. He saw it when a family paid for peace. He saw it when a man crossed the wrong block and was reminded that streets could have owners even when the city map said otherwise. That is where the next layer of the story waits. Not in the old rural West Side, and not only in the overcrowded tenement rooms, but in the specific places where reputation gathered. Certain blocks became known for violence. Certain corners taught strangers to lower their eyes. Certain saloons held court for men who understood the neighbourhood better than any reformer ever would. And among the names that rose from this harsher West Side, one phrase carried the feeling of the place better than almost any other. Battle Row. It sounded like something a reporter might exaggerate, and maybe in time reporters did. But before it was a phrase, it was an experience, a stretch of city where poverty, pride, drink, labour, gang loyalty and street violence met so often that the neighbourhood's roughness finally had an address. By the time Battle Row entered the story, Hell's Kitchen already had most of the ingredients that make a place feared by people who do not live there, and painfully familiar to those who do. The river was near. The freight yards were close enough to tempt and employ the same boys. The rail lines had made danger part of the street itself. The slaughterhouses, gasworks, breweries, coal yards, rum shops, and tenements had given the blocks west of 10th Avenue a density of smell and noise that polite New York could describe with disgust and then walk away from. But a neighbourhood's reputation does not attach itself evenly to every corner. It gathers around certain places. One block becomes the example. One row of buildings becomes the warning. One stretch of street becomes the phrase people repeat because it seems to explain everything. In Hell's Kitchen, one of those places was West 39th Street between 10th and 11th Avenues, remembered as Battle Row. The name sounds almost too convenient. Battle Row. It sounds like something a novelist would invent for a district of brick tenements, saloons, bloodied men, frightened shopkeepers, and children watching everything from the curb. But old cities often produce names like that because people needed practical shorthand. A formal address tells you where something is. A street nickname tells you what people think happens there. Battle Row was not a legal name in the ordinary sense. It was a reputation concentrated into 2 words. It told outsiders to be careful. It told policemen what kind of trouble to expect. It told neighbouring blocks that this was a place where quarrels did not always stay small. It told the young men who lived there that the street already had a story before they added their own fist to it. Picture the block not as a single dramatic scene, but as a daily environment. The street is narrow in feeling even if the map gives it ordinary width, because crowded places feel narrower than they are. Tenements rise close to the sidewalk. Windows look down at everything. Laundry hangs where it can. Children move between stoops, carts and doorways. Men stand outside saloons because indoors is already hot and crowded, and because the street is where news travels fastest. Wagons pass. A horse leaves waste in the road. A woman carrying something heavy steps around it without comment, because there is no use wasting anger on filth that will be replaced by more filth. Somewhere a fight is not happening yet, but it could be. That is the feeling of a street with a hard reputation. Nothing has to be happening for the body to understand that something might. The block's surroundings mattered. Battle Row did not sit in isolation. It belonged to a district already associated with industrial use and overcrowding. West 39th Street near 10th and 11th Avenues lay close to the world of rail yards, freight, riverwork, animal trades, saloons and cheap rooms. It was near the useful parts of the city, and useful parts of cities often become harsh, because they are required to absorb what wealthier neighbourhoods reject. If an area holds gasworks, breweries, factories, slaughterhouses and waterfront labour, then it does not only hold buildings. It holds odours, waste, noise, workers, irregular wages, arguments, taverns, and the constant movement of men who are tired before the evening even begins. Battle Row became notorious not because one day it suddenly chose violence, but because it stood in the middle of conditions that made public conflict easy and private peace difficult. The street fights that helped give Battle Row its name were not always the organised battles people imagine when they hear about old gangs. Some may have been gang fights, yes, but much of the violence in poor neighbourhoods was smaller, quicker and more personal. A debt, a stolen item, a drunken insult, a dispute over a woman, a fight between boys from different corners, a quarrel between families that had been building through walls for weeks, a peddler unlucky enough to be seen as weak, a policeman who entered too confidently, a stranger who did not understand that the safest route through a neighbourhood is sometimes not the shortest one. Violence came in many sizes. It could be one punch, one thrown brick, one knife, one crowd gathering too quickly around a doorway. A place becomes known for battle, not only because every day is a riot, but because everyone understands that ordinary tension there can become physical faster than it would elsewhere. There is a modern temptation to make these old streets colourful. We picture rough Irish boys with marvellous nicknames, saloons with swinging doors, policemen with clubs, women shouting from windows, and some of that belongs to the historical atmosphere. But the closer you get, the less colourful it becomes. A street fight is not charming to the child whose father comes upstairs bleeding. A gang is not picturesque to the shopkeeper who has to pay for protection. A saloon is not romantic to the wife waiting for wages that may never leave the bar. Battle Row was not a stage for entertainment. It was a place where people lived inside other people's danger. That is the thing reputation often hides. Outsiders enjoy the name. Residents endure the consequences. Still, names matter. Battle Row helped teach New York how to imagine Hell's Kitchen. A neighbourhood reputation is built through stories as much as through events. Reporters wrote about the district. Police officers gave guided tours of its worst buildings to journalists. Reformers described the filth, vice, and disorder with the confidence of people who were both horrified and fascinated. Tenements received names that sound almost theatrical now. The Barracks, House of Blazes, Sebastopol, Hell's Kitchen. These names were not neutral. They turned buildings into warnings and their residents into characters inside a moral lesson. A reporter could walk through with a policeman, describe broken rooms, drunk parents, dirty children, vermin, criminal women, violent men, and then leave the reader with the impression that the neighbourhood itself was a kind of human failure. What the reader might not see was the rent, the wages, the landlords, the overcrowding, the industries nearby, the political neglect, the fact that people were being asked to live decently in conditions that made decency exhausting. The naming of tenements by police is especially revealing. Police knew these buildings by trouble because trouble was what brought them there. A patrolman did not necessarily enter a tenement to witness a mother staying up late to mend a child's shirt. He entered because someone had been stabbed, robbed, beaten, arrested, threatened, or accused. His memory of the place was shaped by disorder. Then that memory became a nickname, and the nickname became public truth. It is not that the disorder was invented, it was real. But a place named only for its worst moments becomes trapped inside those moments. The people living there have to carry a reputation they did not personally choose. A child born in a building called Hell's Kitchen enters the world already associated with other people's fear. Battle Row worked the same way. The phrase condensed poverty, industry, immigrant struggle, street masculinity, police conflict, and newspaper appetite into a single image. Once the name circulated, it became easier for outsiders to believe that violence belonged there naturally. If a fight happened on Battle Row, it confirmed the name. If nothing happened, nobody wrote about it. This is how reputations reinforce themselves. A peaceful evening does not travel far. A stabbing does. A mother feeding her children does not become a headline. A riot does. Thousands of ordinary hours disappear under a few memorable incidents, and then history inherits the incidents as if they were the whole life of the block. But inside the block, ordinary hours continued. People woke up there, they cooked there, they argued over money there, they carried laundry, coal, water and groceries. They buried children, welcomed babies, sent boys out on errands and warned girls where not to walk. Some residents likely hated the street's reputation, and some likely used it. That is another truth about hard neighbourhoods. Fear can be a burden, but it can also be a shield. If outsiders are afraid of your block, they may leave you alone. If rival boys know your corner is dangerous, they may think twice before crossing it. A reputation can trap a neighbourhood, but it can also become one of the few protections available to people who do not trust police, courts, landlords, or employers to protect them. The tragedy is that this kind of protection poisons the place it guards. Young men understood this better than anyone. On a street called Battle Row, a boy learned early that fear was useful if it belonged to someone else. He watched older youths occupy space with their bodies. He saw how a group could change the behaviour of everyone around it. He saw strangers hurry, shopkeepers keep quiet, policemen arrive with caution, and women glance from windows when familiar trouble approached. He saw that a gang of boys, if bold enough, could turn poverty into authority within a few blocks. They could not become bankers. They could not become gentlemen simply by wishing it. They could not erase the prejudice that followed Irish working-class families. They could not make landlords merciful or employers steady. But on the street, in the world that actually answered them, they could become feared. For a boy raised with little control over anything, that could feel like a kind of promotion. This is where the neighbourhood's reputation began feeding its future gangs. A gang does not need only members, it needs an environment that understands what the gang is for. Battle Row provided that environment. There were freight yards nearby to raid, there were saloons to gather in. There were residents who might resent the gang but also rely on it when outsiders threatened the block. There were politicians who could find uses for men willing to intimidate. There were policemen who could be fought, avoided, bribed, or watched. There were boys growing up in the street because upstairs rooms could not hold them. There were older criminals who could teach them. There were enough chances to steal that theft became a trade, and enough poverty to make the trade tempting. The street had already done the recruiting before any gang leader spoke a word. The saloon was central to this world. A Battle Row saloon was not simply a place to drink. It was warmth, news, hiring, gambling, argument, male society, political conversation, and criminal office. A saloon-keeper could be more than a seller of alcohol. He might be a broker of information, a holder of debts, a friend of ward politicians, a silent partner in illegal business, or a man who knew when to call the police and when to make sure the police arrived too late. The saloon offered shelter from crowded rooms and exhausting work, but it also concentrated the neighbourhood's volatility. A man who'd been humiliated at the docks could regain his voice there. A gang could use the room as headquarters. A young tough could be noticed by older men. Wages could disappear. A fight could begin with a joke and end in the street. Women were not absent from this violent geography, though history has often treated them as background figures unless they became notorious enough to shock male observers. The story of women associated with the Gophers and Battle Row reminds us that poverty did not create a neat division between male street danger and female domestic suffering. Women could be victims of the neighbourhood's violence, managers of households trying to survive it, witnesses who knew more than they could safely say, and in some cases participants in street power themselves. A woman who threw bricks from a roof, guarded a saloon, fought alongside men, or organised other women into a force for intimidation was not a novelty, because women were naturally peaceful, and one had gone wrong. She was a product of the same world. The street had lessons for everyone. It taught men one kind of hardness and women another, and sometimes the two met in public violence that startled outsiders, because it violated their idea of what women were supposed to be. But for most women, the daily struggle was less dramatic and more relentless. Battle Row's reputation made their ordinary work harder. If a street was known for fights, then sending a child outside required calculation. If saloons held dangerous men, then passing them after dark required judgment. If police came often, then residents had to decide when to speak and when silence was safer. If a husband drank or fought, a woman might be forced to manage both his injuries and the household damage that came afterward. If a son began following older boys, she might know exactly where that road led and still lack the power to stop him. The famous violence of the block was public, but its consequences entered kitchens, bedrooms, and stairwells. The physical construction of the tenements intensified everything. Thin walls do not allow conflict to stay contained. A quarrel in one room becomes a building's knowledge. A crying child becomes everyone's irritation. A drunken return at midnight wakes families who need sleep for work at dawn. Crowded stairs become meeting places, dispute zones, gossip channels, and escape routes. In a better-built, less crowded district, people might have had space to cool down. In Battle Row, space itself was scarce. Anger had nowhere private to go. It leaked into hallways, onto stoops, and finally into the street where it could gather witnesses. A fight with witnesses becomes a performance. A performance demands an ending that preserves pride. Pride, in a poor street, could be one of the few possessions a person felt he owned entirely. Police presence did not necessarily calm the neighbourhood. Sometimes it inflamed it. A patrolman entering Battle Row was not entering neutral ground. He represented a city many residents saw as hostile, corrupt, indifferent, or predatory. The police could protect, but they could also harass. They could break up fights, But they could also use clubs freely against people with little recourse. They could arrest a violent man, but they could also take money from another one. In a district like Hell's Kitchen, the relationship between police and residents was tangled with class, ethnicity, politics, and fear. When police called a building by a brutal nickname, residents heard more than description. They heard contempt, and contempt does not create cooperation. It creates silence, resistance, and sometimes open hostility. This tension gave the street another layer of danger. Law was present, but its legitimacy was not always trusted. That is a dangerous combination. In places where law is absent, people make their own systems. In places where law is present but distrusted, those systems compete. A resident might call a policeman in one situation and warn a neighbour against speaking to him in another. A gang might be hated for its brutality, and still preferred over outside interference when the conflict involved rival groups. A saloon keeper might pay for protection, and then use police connections when convenient. Everyone adjusted according to circumstance. This is how informal power survives. It does not need everyone to love it. It only needs enough people to believe resistance will cost more than cooperation. The newspapers helped fix the image of the neighbourhood in the wider city. A police-guided tour through the worst blocks could produce descriptions that readers consumed with a mixture of horror and excitement. The language could be harsh, moralising, and sometimes openly prejudiced. Reporters described smells, filth, drunkenness, vice and crime in ways that made the neighbourhood seem nearly foreign, even though it was only a short distance from more respectable streets. There is something important here. For middle-class readers, Hell's Kitchen was close enough to be frightening and far enough to be exotic. It was not across an ocean. It was across avenues. That nearness made it fascinating. It meant that the dangerous poor were not hidden in some distant industrial town. They were living in Manhattan, west of the places where the city wished to see itself as modern and prosperous. Battle Row became useful to that imagination. It gave writers a place to point. Here, they could say, is what happens when poverty, immigrant vice, bad housing and lawlessness are allowed to gather. Some reformers genuinely wanted improvement, and some police genuinely wanted order, but the storytelling often turned residents into evidence rather than people. The block became a symbol. Symbols are powerful, but they are not fair. They cannot show the woman who keeps her room clean despite the building. They cannot show the man who refuses to drink because he has seen what drink did to his father. They cannot show the child who wants school more than the street, or the neighbour who quietly helps a family avoid eviction, or the old person who remembers when the area was less crowded. A symbol reduces. Battle Row was reduced to battle. Still, we should not soften what happened there. The reputation was not invented out of nothing. There were real fights, real thefts, real gangs, real fear. Residents did defy law and order at times. Criminals did use the district. Rough men did make life harder for weaker people. It is possible to understand the conditions that produced violence without pretending the violence did no damage. In fact, understanding the conditions makes the damage clearer. These were not harmless legends. They were systems of intimidation operating among people who already had very little. A family struggling with rent did not need a gang demanding loyalty. A widow did not need a saloon full of men spilling fights into the street. A shopkeeper did not need broken windows and threats. The city neglected the district, and then the strongest people inside the district often exploited that neglect. That is one of the bitter patterns in the history of poverty. The people most harmed by harsh conditions are often harmed again by those who learn to profit from the harshness. A landlord profits from crowding. A saloon profits from escape. A gang profits from fear. A corrupt official profits from both disorder and reform. Each extracts something. The ordinary resident pays in money, sleep, safety, dignity, or silence. Battle Row was not only a place where poor people fought, it was a place where multiple systems fed off the fact that poor people had few choices. That is why the street's reputation matters. It was not just a colourful nickname, it was the visible surface of a deeper economy of pressure. The phrase, "might makes right," was often applied to places like this by observers who meant it as condemnation. They were not entirely wrong. In Battle Row, physical power did matter. Numbers mattered, reputation mattered. A man backed by a gang could do things a solitary man could not. A group of boys could make an entire block change its behaviour. A woman with enough allies could be feared in her own right. A saloon with political protection could survive pressure that might close another establishment. But the phrase also reveals the failure of lawful systems. When might makes right in a neighbourhood, it often means other forms of right have failed to protect people. Courts are too distant. Police are distrusted. Employers are arbitrary. Housing law is weak. City attention is intermittent. So people learn to respect the power that actually arrives. Children learn this with terrible efficiency. A boy watching from a doorway might see a policeman mocked, a drunk beaten, a peddler robbed, a gang member admired, a mother ignored, a father humiliated, a shopkeeper threatened, and a priest respected, all in the same week. He would not need anyone to explain the hierarchy. He would absorb it. He would learn that goodness and power were not the same thing. He would learn that adults often praised obedience but obeyed fear. He would learn that the street rewarded quickness, nerve, group loyalty, and a willingness to strike first. If he was gentle, he might hide it. If he was angry, he might find uses for anger. If an older gang member noticed him, offered approval, gave him a small task, handed him coins, or simply treated him as if he mattered, the pull could be strong. A child does not join a dangerous world only because he loves danger. Sometimes he joins because danger is the first place that gives him a role. The rivalries that later defined the Gophers and other West Side gangs were built from this block-level culture. Before a gang controlled territory, boys defended corners. Before organised rackets, there were informal thefts, raids, fights and loyalties. Before a criminal reputation became profitable, a street reputation had to be established. Battle Row helped give Hell's Kitchen that foundation. It showed how a block could be known, feared and treated almost like a separate jurisdiction inside the city. To outsiders, it was evidence of urban disorder. To local toughs, it was proof that their world had power. To residents, it was both danger and identity. By the turn of the century, reform-minded New York would begin to attack some of the worst old slums, at least in certain places. Model tenements, settlement houses, new regulations and public pressure tried to address the physical conditions that had produced so much misery. But reform never arrives in a vacuum, and it never arrives without leaving something unresolved. You can demolish a building more quickly than you can undo the habits formed inside it. You can rename a district more quickly than you can erase the fear attached to its streets. You can improve air and light and still leave young men with memories of how power once worked on the block. Battle Row as a physical place could change, but the lessons of Battle Row travelled. What was born there was not simply a name, it was a neighbourhood reputation that turned into inheritance. Hell's Kitchen became known as a place where the poor were not passive, where the police were not always obeyed, where strangers should watch themselves, where saloons mattered, where boys organised, where women could be as tough as the men when the street demanded it, and where the city's industrial backside produced a social world that frightened the city's more comfortable face. That reputation drew attention, and attention brought more stories, and more stories made the reputation stronger. Soon the names of particular gangs would do what Battle Row had already begun to do. They would concentrate fear into language. The Gophers, the Parlour Mob, the Hudson Dusters across other parts of the city. Men with nicknames so vivid they sound fictional, until you remember that behind every nickname was a person shaped by real rooms, real streets, real hunger, and real violence. Battle Row gave Hell's Kitchen a vocabulary of fear, and once a neighbourhood has that vocabulary, the next generation learns how to speak it almost before anyone teaches them. The streets had already taught their lessons by the time the Gophers became a name people knew to fear. Battle Row had given Hell's Kitchen an address for violence, but a reputation on its own does not collect money, control corners, intimidate witnesses, or send boys out to steal from freight yards. For that, the neighbourhood needed men, and not just men acting alone. It needed groups that could turn fear into a system. That is what the Gophers became. They were not a modern crime family with a neat chain of command, officers, lawyers, accountants, and disciplined soldiers waiting for orders. They were rougher than that, looser, younger, and closer to the street. They grew out of the West Side itself, from the tenements, saloons, rail yards, docks, and blocks where boys learned very early that respect could be forced from people, even when it could not be earned in any ordinary respectable way. To outsiders, the Gophers looked like proof that Hell's Kitchen was rotten. To the boys who joined them, they may have looked like a way out of helplessness, or at least a way to make helplessness belong to someone else for a while. That is one of the uncomfortable things about street gangs. They are destructive, but they also offer something. They offer belonging. They offer protection. They offer money, even if it is dirty money. They offer a name. And in a neighbourhood where a poor boy's legal name might mean nothing beyond a line on a school record or a police blotter, a gang name could make people step aside. The Gophers emerged in the late 19th century, when Hell's Kitchen had already been hardened by decades of poverty and industrial use. Their world was the Lower West Side, a district of Irish working-class families, day labourers, railroad men, dock workers, saloon keepers, gamblers, prostitutes, ward politicians, policemen, and children who spent too much time in streets that were already half controlled by older boys. The gang's name itself sounds almost ridiculous at first, almost harmless, like something you would give to a club of mischievous children. But the men who carried it were not harmless, and the name may have carried the sense of men who moved through basements, cellars, holes, freight spaces, and the underside of the city. Whether the explanation is exact or not, the image fits the environment. The Gophers belonged to a neighbourhood with an above-ground life and an underground life. Above ground there were families, shops, churches, wages, funerals, rent, and daily work. Underneath that there were theft networks, gambling rooms, saloon deals, protection money, political favours, stolen goods, and violence that everyone understood better than they wanted to admit. The saloon was the most important room in that second world. If you want to understand the Gophers, do not picture them first in an alley with weapons drawn. Picture them in a saloon after dark. The gaslight is low. The air is thick with tobacco smoke, damp wool, beer, sweat, and the smell of men who have spent the day working around freight, animals, coal, or the river. There is noise, but not all of it is loud. Some of the most important talk happens in low voices. A man leans toward another man and mentions a shipment coming in. A saloon keeper hears about a policeman's patrol habit. A boy waits near the door, trying to look older than he is. Someone is playing cards. Someone is watching the cards too closely. A woman comes in looking for a husband who has not brought wages home. A local tough sees her and smiles in a way that is not friendly. The saloon is warm, but warmth is not the same as safety. In a tenement district, the saloon had many jobs. It was a drinking place, but also a hiring hall, message centre, political club, gambling room, debt office, hiding place, and headquarters. For men with crowded rooms upstairs and no private space, the saloon could feel almost like a living room. For gang members, it was more than that. It was where they could be seen. Visibility mattered. A gang cannot rule only through violence. It has to rule through the expectation of violence, and expectation is built by being present. A man who sits in the same saloon every night, surrounded by allies, noticed by everyone, feared by enough people, becomes part of the furniture of power. People learn his moods. They learn when not to speak. They learn what kind of joke is safe and what kind is not. They learn whether a debt can be delayed, whether a favour must be repaid, whether a stranger should be warned away or allowed to walk into trouble. The Gophers used saloons because the saloons were already the nerve centres of the neighbourhood. The gang did not invent that world. They moved into it and made it more dangerous. Accounts of the Gophers often describe a rough committee of leaders, men with names that sound as if they came from a crime novel, but belong to real people moving through real streets. Marty Brennan, Stumpy Malarkey, Newburgh Gallagher, and others who are remembered in the later underworld histories. Some of these accounts should be handled carefully, because early crime writing loved colourful detail and sometimes repeated legend as fact. But even when the details blur, the larger pattern is clear. The Gophers grew by organising what had once been more scattered. They stole from freight yards, they robbed strangers, they took part in gambling and vice. They used violence to settle disputes and protect territory. They had relationships with saloons and political figures. They fought rivals. They frightened police. They drew younger boys into their orbit. The gang was not a random crowd of troublemakers. It was a neighbourhood institution built from fear, opportunity, and the failures of lawful authority. Their connection to the rail yards was especially important. Freight meant goods, and goods meant money. The West Side's rail and dock economy placed theft opportunities within walking distance of the boys most likely to take them. A freight car might hold food, cloth, liquor, tools, or other cargo that could be sold through fences and informal networks. Stealing from freight did not feel to many young men like stealing from a neighbour. It felt like taking from a distant company, a railroad, a merchant, a system that had already taken plenty from them. That moral distance matters. A man may hesitate to rob the woman upstairs. He may feel less hesitation about goods sitting in a yard owned by people he will never meet. Again, this does not make the theft harmless. Someone paid, someone lost. Violence often followed. But the psychology of the act was shaped by the district. The rail yards made crime practical. The neighbourhood made it understandable. The saloons made it organised. And the gang made it dangerous enough to matter. Police did not control Hell's Kitchen the way they controlled cleaner, wealthier streets. That does not mean police were absent. They came, often enough, and sometimes with force, but presence and control are different things. In Hell's Kitchen, police entered a neighbourhood where they might be outnumbered, watched from windows, misled by residents, and challenged by men who had built reputations on not backing down. Some accounts describe policemen entering the worst parts of the district in groups rather than alone, and whether every story is exact or exaggerated, the point remains. The police did not move through these blocks with easy confidence. One later account of One Lung Curran, one of the Gophers' most famous leaders, says he became known for attacking lone policemen and even stealing their uniforms. That detail has the shape of legend, and it may have been polished by repeated telling, but the meaning behind it is clear. To humiliate a policeman was to humiliate the authority of the city itself. It told the neighbourhood that the gang could make even the law look vulnerable. That kind of message travels faster than any official announcement. A stolen uniform, a beaten officer, a story repeated in saloons and hallways. These things taught boys that power was not fixed. It could be grabbed. It could be mocked. It could be worn like a costume if you were bold enough. One Lung Curran's nickname, like so many underworld nicknames, turns illness, injury, or physical peculiarity into identity. Gang names did this constantly. They reduced men to memorable labels, a damaged body, a habit, a weapon, a place of origin, a face, a joke that stuck. These nicknames were funny until they were not. They made men easy to remember and hard to treat as ordinary. A man called One Lung or Stumpy or Goo Goo or Killer is already halfway turned into a story. That helps explain why the Gophers lived on in memory. Their names were vivid. Their neighbourhood was vivid. Their violence was useful to newspapers and later writers. But beneath the nicknames were young men who had grown up in crowded rooms, dirty streets, and a world where legal success was difficult to imagine. Some were cruel, some were probably charming, some were cowards in certain situations and brave in others. Some loved their mothers and terrified strangers. Human beings are rarely consistent enough to make crime stories simple. Only Madden is the name that pulls the Gophers forward into the next era. He was born in England to an Irish family and came to New York as a boy, settling into the same Hell's Kitchen environment that had produced so many street fighters before him. By his early years in the neighbourhood, he was already connected to the Gophers. Later, he would become much more than a street gangster. He would move into Prohibition-era bootlegging, nightclub ownership, and the larger world of organised crime. But before that, he was a West Side tough learning the local rules. He learned weapons. He learned intimidation. He learned that reputation could protect a man as surely as a wall. He learned that witnesses could be frightened, rivals could be removed, and violence could serve business if it was applied with enough calculation. Madden's later life can make the early Gopher years look like a prelude. But for Hell's Kitchen residents living through it, the prelude was dangerous enough. The boys who became men in these gangs did not wait for Prohibition to make the neighbourhood afraid. They already ruled after dark in the ways that mattered locally. After dark, Hell's Kitchen changed. The workday loosened its grip, but the streets did not become peaceful. Men who had spent the day under orders now entered a night where other rules mattered. Wages were in pockets, at least for those who had been paid. Saloons filled. Arguments warmed. Gambling tables drew men who hoped to turn a little money into more and usually did not. Prostitutes, pimps, thieves and lookouts moved through the district's night economy. Boys watched doorways, carried messages, or waited to be trusted with something more serious. A drunk could be rolled, a stranger could be followed, a shopkeeper could be warned, a rival could be found. The darkness did not create the criminal world, but it helped it operate. Gaslight and saloon light made pockets of visibility, while alleys, freight spaces, stairwells, and side streets offered cover. The night belonged to men who knew where to stand and who to avoid. This is why the phrase "ruled after dark" matters. The Gophers did not need to govern every hour of every life. They needed to control enough fear during the hours when fear mattered most. If a resident knew not to speak against them, that was power. If a saloon keeper paid them, that was power. If a policeman thought twice before entering alone, that was power. If a boy wanted to join them more than he wanted to finish school, that was power. If a witness forgot what he had seen because remembering could be fatal, that was power. Street rule is not always visible from a distance. It is made of small adjustments in other people's behaviour, a glance away, a slower answer, a payment made without being demanded twice. A route changed, a door closed, a mother calling her child inside when certain men appear. The Gophers lived inside those adjustments. Their power was not only in what they did, but in what people expected them to do. The gang also depended on the neighbourhood's silence, and silence in Hell's Kitchen was not simply cowardice. It could be survival. If a man testified against a Gopher, he did not go home to a protected suburb. He went home to the same block, the same building, the same staircase, the same street where friends of the accused might be waiting. Police could not stand at every door. Courts could not sleep beside every witness. A person who spoke had to live with the consequences after the officials left. This created a terrible bargain. Silence allowed violent men to grow stronger, but speaking could bring danger directly to a family. Many people chose silence because they understood the limits of official protection better than reformers did. The law could ask for courage. The neighbourhood decided how expensive courage would be. Political machines understood the usefulness of men like the Gophers. Tammany-style politics depended on votes, loyalty, favours, intimidation, and the ability to mobilise neighbourhoods. A gang could help turn out voters, discourage opponents, protect friendly saloons, and make itself useful toward leaders who preferred results over cleanliness. This did not mean every politician openly commanded gangs in a simple way. The relationships were often murkier, full of favours, understandings, shared interests, and mutual benefit. A saloon keeper tied to politics might know gang leaders. Gang leaders might know who needed help on election day. A policeman might know which arrest was expected and which man should be left alone until after a useful task was done. The system was not always written down because it did not need to be. Everyone involved understood enough. This is one reason gangs survived. They were not only criminal outcasts, they were embedded in local power. That made them harder to remove than a single thief or drunk. The Gophers also had younger satellites, boys and smaller crews who learned from them. This apprentice structure mattered. A gang renews itself by turning admiration into recruitment. The youngest boys watched the older ones with a mixture of fear, envy, and hunger. They saw the clothes, the swagger, the attention, the way saloon doors opened, the way people made space. A boy who'd been ignored by teachers, bosses, and the respectable city might be noticed by a gang member and feel, perhaps for the first time, that he had been chosen. He might begin with small tasks, carrying a message, watching for police, stealing something minor, standing with others to look threatening. Each small act pulled him further in. By the time he was asked to do something serious, he might already owe too much loyalty to refuse. This is how street life trains children gradually. It does not always begin with murder or robbery. It begins with attention. The women connected to this world complicate the picture even more. Hell's Kitchen had women who suffered under gang violence, but also women who participated in the neighbourhood's street culture. Later accounts describe the Battle Row Ladies Social and Athletic Club, sometimes called the Lady Gophers, associated with female street fighters such as Battle Annie. Some of the details are hard to separate from legend, but the existence of tough women in this environment should not surprise us. Women in Hell's Kitchen were not sheltered from poverty, danger, or public conflict. They lived in the same buildings, walked the same streets, dealt with the same police, saloons, landlords, and gangs. A woman who learned to fight was not violating the neighbourhood's logic. She was obeying it. If the street rewarded toughness, women could become tough too. That did not make their lives freer in any simple way. It often meant they had to become hard in order not to be crushed by hardness around them. In some gang disputes, women acted as allies, lookouts, fighters, or protectors of territory. In ordinary households, women also acted as the first line of defence against the gang's pull on younger children. They knew which boy was drifting toward trouble. They knew which saloon had become too familiar to a husband. They knew which men had to be greeted carefully and which ones should never be allowed into the room. The Gophers ruled after dark, but mothers studied that rule because their families had to live beneath it. There is something important to understand about fear in a place like this. Fear did not mean constant panic. People cannot live in constant panic. The body refuses. Instead, fear became routine. It became knowledge. You knew where not to linger. You knew which doorway was watched. You knew whose argument to ignore. You knew that a shout from one saloon was ordinary, and a sudden silence outside another was not. You knew which policeman was brutal, which one was corrupt, which one was merely tired. You knew the difference between a drunk making noise and a gang gathering with purpose. Residents of Hell's Kitchen were not naive victims wandering through danger. They were experts in their own environment. Their expertise was not enough to make them safe, but it helped them survive. This is another reason outsiders misunderstood the neighbourhood. They saw chaos. Residents saw patterns. The Gophers themselves were part of a wider city of gangs. New York at the turn of the 20th century had many criminal groups, and the Gophers were not alone in using poverty, ethnicity, politics, and territory as foundations for power. The Hudson Dusters, the Parlor Mob, the Guerrillas, and others moved through overlapping worlds of theft, gambling, vice, and violence. Rivalry could turn deadly because gangs were competing not only for pride but for income. Control of a block, a saloon, a gambling room, or access to freight could produce money. When money is attached to reputation, reputation must be defended. A slight could not always be ignored because ignoring it might make future payments harder to collect. In that sense, violence became business maintenance. It signalled that the gang remained dangerous enough to deserve fear, That is one of the coldest truths in this story. Some violence was emotional, drunken, impulsive. Some of it was calculated. The calculated violence may have done even more to make the neighbourhood feared, because it taught people that brutality could be used as a tool. Still, the Gophers were not invincible. Street gangs burn hot and unstable. Their members are young, reckless, visible, and often addicted to the very public drama that makes police attention inevitable. Leaders are arrested, killed, betrayed, or weakened. Rivals rise, politics shifts, reform pressure increases, prisons remove key men. The same violence that builds a reputation can bring the weight of the city down on the people using it. By the 1910s, the older Gopher world was already under pressure. Arrests, deaths, rivalries, and changing criminal opportunities began breaking the gang's old form apart. One Lungcurran died in 1917, and by then the street gang culture that had made Hell's Kitchen so notorious was beginning to change. But decline is not the same as disappearance. The habits remained, the saloons remained, the relationships between vice, politics, and violence remained. Young men who had learned the old lessons were still alive. One of them, Oni Madden, would carry the neighbourhood's street education into a new age, one where alcohol itself became the foundation of a national criminal economy. That is the thing about Hell's Kitchen. Its criminal world did not end when one gang weakened. It adapted. The Gophers had grown from the rail yards, docks, saloons, and tenements of the Old West Side. Prohibition would give men like Madden something larger to organise, something more profitable than stolen freight or street robbery, something that linked Hell's Kitchen to speakeasies, nightclubs, politicians, police, and underworld figures far beyond Battle Row. The boys who once learned power under gaslight were about to enter a city lit by illegal money, and the old neighbourhood, with all its habits of silence, intimidation, loyalty, and survival, was ready to teach the new criminal age how business could be done. The boys who once learned power under gaslight were about to enter a city lit by illegal money, and the old neighbourhood, with all its habits of silence, intimidation, loyalty, and survival, was ready to teach the new criminal age how business could be done. The Gophers had belonged to the rougher west side of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a place of saloons, freight theft, dock work, street fights, and local protection. Their world was dangerous, but it was still close to the pavement. A gang stole what it could reach. It fought the men who challenged its corners. It drank in local saloons, frightened local witnesses, and grew out of the daily life of a few hard blocks. Prohibition changed the scale. It did not make Hell's Kitchen respectable. It did not make the old neighbourhood gentle. What it did was take a country that already drank heavily, declare the legal sale of alcohol forbidden, and hand men like Oni Madden a business opportunity larger than anything the old Gophers had known. When the 18th Amendment took effect in January of 1920, and the Volstead Act gave the law its machinery, the United States did not suddenly become sober. That is the first thing to understand. A law can change what is legal overnight. It cannot change appetite overnight. Men who had been drinking in saloons for decades did not wake up one morning and decide that water would do. Women who had used alcohol medicinally, socially, quietly, or secretly did not simply forget it existed. Hotels did not lose thirsty guests. Nightclubs did not lose their evening crowd. Restaurants did not lose the habit of serving something stronger than coffee. The law closed the front door and created 100 side doors. It turned bartenders into criminals, breweries into secret suppliers, truck drivers into smugglers, policemen into obstacles or partners, and gangsters into businessmen. That was the strange power of prohibition. It did not abolish alcohol, it changed who profited from it. For Hell's Kitchen, this mattered because the neighbourhood already knew how to move around the law. That may sound harsh, but it is historically important. The West Side had long been a place where official rules and street rules existed side by side. People knew which saloons served which men. They knew which police officers were dangerous, which were corrupt, and which were simply tired of fighting a district that seemed to refill itself with trouble as fast as they could empty one cell. They knew how freight disappeared, how witnesses forgot, how a block could go quiet when asked questions by outsiders. These were not new lessons in 1920. Prohibition gave those lessons a national market. A man who once controlled a few corners could now control a route, a supply, a club, a set of payments, a relationship with police, and a customer base that reached far beyond the old tenement streets. Only Madden understood that shift better than most men from his world. He had not begun as a polished underworld executive. He began as a street tough shaped by Hell's Kitchen. Born in Leeds, England, to an Irish family, he arrived in New York as a boy and grew up in the hard Irish blocks of the West Side, where the Gophers were not legend but immediate company. He learned violence early. He learned how to use fear as a tool. He learned that a reputation could move ahead of a man and do some of his work before he entered a room. By the time he was still young, he had already become associated with serious violence, and his nickname, the Killer, was not given to him because he was good at bookkeeping. Later accounts of his early years are sometimes difficult to separate from embellishment, because underworld history attracts exaggeration the way a saloon attracts smoke, but the broad outline is clear enough. Madden was a product of the old Hell's Kitchen gang world, and he carried that old street education into the new age of illegal alcohol. There is a moment in his life that feels almost like the city changing costume around him. In 1915, Madden went to Sing Sing after a manslaughter conviction connected to the killing of a rival, William Moore, known as Little Patsy Doyle. He entered prison as a violent West Side gangster. When he was released in 1923, the country he returned to had changed. Prohibition was already in force. The old Gopher structure had weakened. The streets he knew were still rough, but the smartest criminals were no longer thinking only about street robberies and local fights. They were thinking about supply. Beer, whiskey, gin, rum, trucks, warehouses, speakeasies, nightclubs, police payoffs, political arrangements, and distribution. Madden came out of prison into a city where alcohol had become one of the most profitable illegal commodities in America, and he had exactly the kind of background that could help him survive in that business. The change from street gang to bootlegging operation required a different kind of mind. A gang could be reckless and still frighten a block. A liquor business had to be steady enough to satisfy customers. It needed deliverers, it needed storage, it needed drivers, it needed protection, it needed someone to deal with rival suppliers and someone to deal with police. It needed saloons and clubs willing to buy. It needed violence available but not always visible, because too much open bloodshed could interrupt business. This is where men like Madden began to look less like the old neighbourhood brawler and more like a manager of a criminal service. He did not stop being dangerous. The danger became more useful when it was attached to organisation. Think about what a single bottle in a New York speakeasy required during Prohibition. It had to come from somewhere. It might begin as smuggled liquor, stolen liquor, homemade liquor, industrial alcohol diverted and redistilled, or beer brewed under illegal conditions. It had to be transported through a city where enforcement agents, rival gangs, thieves and informers all had reasons to interfere. It had to be stored somewhere before sale. It had to reach a club, restaurant, apartment or hidden bar. The owner had to feel confident enough to serve it. The customer had to know where to go, how to enter and whom to trust. The police nearby had to be fooled, bribed, distracted, overwhelmed, or quietly included in the arrangement. None of this was simple. Every drink poured in a speakeasy sat on top of a whole unseen chain of labour, crime, risk, and money. This was the criminal city beneath the city. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment, because New York in the 1920s did not have two separate worlds, one lawful and one criminal. They overlapped constantly. A respectable man could leave an office, pass a policeman, enter a fashionable club, and drink illegal liquor supplied by gangsters. A politician could condemn crime in public and depend on criminals in private. A policeman could raid one speakeasy and accept money from another. A society woman could dance to a famous orchestra in a room where the alcohol was illegal, the owner was connected to violence, and the performers entered through a racial order that treated them as both stars and servants. Prohibition did not push crime to the margins. It brought crime into the evening habits of people who considered themselves respectable. It made illegal business social. Hell's Kitchen's old saloon culture helped prepare men for this. Before Prohibition, the saloon had been the neighbourhood's living room, hiring hall, political office, and danger zone. After Prohibition, the legal saloon disappeared on paper, but the function did not disappear. It moved, hid, renamed itself, changed doors, changed signals, changed menus, changed relationships. A drinking place might now require a password, a buzzer, a peephole, a trusted introduction, or a public face that gave no sign of what happened inside. Some places were shabby and local, others were glamorous enough to attract people who enjoyed the thrill of breaking the law in good clothes. That difference mattered. The poor had always been policed for drink and disorder. Now the rich were drinking illegally too, and their involvement gave the whole system a strange protection. It is easier to enforce morality against the powerless than against judges, businessmen, actors, athletes, politicians, and wealthy young people with money to spend. Madden's world expanded beyond Hell's Kitchen, but the West Side remained part of his foundation. He knew the value of territory, silence, and reputation. He understood the kind of men who could drive trucks, guard shipments, frighten witnesses, and keep mouths closed. He also understood entertainment. That may seem like a separate talent, but in Prohibition New York it was central. People did not simply want liquor. They wanted an evening. They wanted music, tables, beautiful rooms, singers, dancers, jokes, flirtation, and the feeling that the law was somewhere outside the door rather than inside the room with them. The successful bootlegger did not only supply alcohol, he supplied atmosphere. The Cotton Club became the most famous example connected to Madden, though it belonged geographically to Harlem, not Hell's Kitchen. That distinction matters, because it shows how far a man from the West Side could reach once Prohibition enlarged the business. The club began as Club Deluxe, opened by the heavyweight champion Jack Johnson at 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue. After Madden took it over in the 1920s, it became the Cotton Club, one of the best-known night spots in the city. It was glamorous, famous, and deeply ugly in the racial logic it used. Black performers filled the stage with extraordinary talent. White audiences filled many of the seats. The decor and entertainment often leaned on plantation and jungle themes created for white fascination. It could help launch careers and exploit the people whose talent made it famous at the same time. That is one of the hard truths of the jazz age. The music was brilliant. The conditions around it could be cruel. For Madden, the Cotton Club was also a business outlet. His beer, often remembered as Madden's number one, needed customers, and a nightclub full of thirsty patrons was more than a cultural venue. It was distribution wrapped in velvet, music, lighting, and celebrity. This is how Prohibition-era crime dressed itself up. The old Hell's Kitchen saloon had been smoky, crowded, and rough. The Cotton Club was polished, staged, and fashionable. But the underlying fact was similar. Illegal alcohol moved through a protected room because people wanted it, and powerful men could profit from it. The difference was that now the customers included the kind of people newspapers described with interest rather than disgust. When poor men drank in a West Side saloon, it was vice. When well-dressed crowds drank in a Harlem nightclub, it became nightlife. This is not to say Madden abandoned violence. The men of his generation did not become businessmen in the clean sense. They carried violence with them as insurance. The 1920s underworld was full of rivalries, shifting alliances, ambushes, betrayals, and murders. Bootlegging profits were too large to remain peaceful. Trucks could be hijacked, shipments could be seized, speakeasy owners could be pressured. A man who controlled supply could become rich, and another man might decide to take that supply from him. The law made the market illegal, and illegality meant disputes could not be settled in court. If a rival stole your shipment, you did not sue him. You sent men to recover it, frighten him, punish him, or kill him. Prohibition created wealth without lawful protection, and violence rushed into that gap. The police were everywhere in this story, but never simply as heroes or villains. Some officers tried to enforce the law honestly. Some were overwhelmed by the scale of defiance. Some were corrupted. Some raided loudly when pressure came from above, and looked away when money came from below. The law itself had placed them in a nearly impossible position. They were expected to stop a trade that huge numbers of citizens still wanted. Every speakeasy door represented not only a crime, but also a customer base. Enforcement could not only be a matter of finding criminals, it meant confronting the habits of a city. That gave criminals leverage. If enough respectable people wanted the illegal product, the supplier gained a strange legitimacy. He was not merely a thug in an alley, he was the man who made the party possible. Politicians also moved through this hidden economy. Prohibition did not eliminate machine politics, it gave machines new forms of value. A club owner needed protection, a bootlegger needed information, a politician needed votes, money, loyalty, and sometimes muscle. Police assignments mattered. Raids could be delayed or directed. Licenses for businesses that were not officially selling liquor still mattered. Judges, lawyers, bondsmen, ward leaders, and police captains all became part of the larger environment in which criminal business operated. It would be too simple to say every official was corrupt. That would be false. But enough of the system could be bent that men like Madden understood how useful connections were. The old West Side lessons still applied. Power was not only what you did yourself. It was who would answer when you needed something done, and who would refuse to see what you needed hidden. There is a quiet irony in Madden's rise. Hell's Kitchen had long been treated as a place of disorder by the better parts of New York. Its boys were rough. Its saloons were dangerous. Its gangs were proof of slum vice. Then Prohibition arrived, and suddenly the skills learned in that despised neighborhood became useful to the wider city. The ability to intimidate, the ability to keep silent, the ability to organize men outside formal law, the ability to move goods through unofficial channels, the ability to negotiate with police, politicians, and rival criminals. The city had looked at Hell's Kitchen and seen a problem. Prohibition looked at men trained by that problem and made them valuable. For ordinary residents of Hell's Kitchen, the glamour of the 1920s did not erase the old pressures. A nightclub in Harlem might sparkle. A speakeasy in Midtown might draw celebrities. A bootlegger might become rich enough to wear better suits and sit at better tables, but the West Side tenements still held families dealing with rent, injury, unemployment, drink, and fear. Some young men found work in the new illegal economy as drivers, guards, lookouts, enforcers, or small distributors. That work could bring money quickly, and quick money has a special pull in a poor neighborhood. A legitimate job might exhaust a man for low wages. A single illegal delivery might pay more than honest labor. A boy watching that comparison did not need a lecture in economics. He could see the coats, the cash, the women, the attention, the ability to enter rooms that once would have thrown him out. Prohibition made crime look like advancement, but advancement in that world came with a bill. A man tied to bootlegging owed favours. He became known. He could be arrested, beaten, betrayed, or killed. If he carried a gun, he might eventually use it. If he used it, someone might come for him. If he rose too quickly, rivals noticed. If he talked too freely, friends noticed. The money that entered a household from illegal work did not always bring security. It could bring fear to the door. A mother might be glad her son had cash and terrified of why. A wife might enjoy a better room and learn not to ask about certain nights. A child might admire a father's fine shoes without knowing the price attached to them. The criminal city beneath the city did not only exist in clubs and back rooms, It entered homes through pockets, rumours, absences and blood. Madden's own movement into nightlife shows how the gangster image began to change in public. The old street tough was frightening but low. The prohibition gangster could become famous. He could know entertainers, athletes, club owners, reporters and politicians. He could be seen in rooms where money and glamour softened the sight of violence. He could appear less like a slum product and more like a man of the age, a figure of speed, risk, style and appetite. That image has misled people ever since. The suit did not erase the street. The nightclub did not erase the freight yard. The table in the good room did not erase the witness who kept quiet because he was afraid. The Jazz Age gangster was not charming because he stopped being dangerous. He was charming because danger had found better lighting. The Cotton Club especially shows this double vision. On one side, it was a landmark in entertainment history, connected to the rise of major black performers and the sound of Harlem in the national imagination. On the other side, it was controlled by white criminal interests and served largely white audiences under rules that reflected the racism of the time. A person could sit there, hear extraordinary music, drink illegal beer, and participate in exploitation without feeling like a villain. That is how systems work. They make participation feel ordinary. The customer remembers the band. The owner counts the money. The performer carries both opportunity and insult. The gangster supplies the liquor. The city pretends not to understand too clearly how everything is connected. New York's underworld during Prohibition was not one neat empire. It was a shifting field of Irish, Jewish, Italian and other criminal groups, with alliances and rivalries that changed as profits changed. Madden, as an Irish gangster from the West Side, belonged to an older ethnic street gang tradition that was being overtaken in many areas by more structured mafia organisations. That did not happen all at once. The 1920s were a transition. Men from the old gang still mattered. Men from newer organisations were rising. Bootlegging gave everyone money to fight over. The city's criminal map was being redrawn while the legal city kept pretending, in public at least, that the central issue was morality. In practice, the issue was supply and power. Hell's Kitchen remained important because it had a memory of how power worked without permission. A neighbourhood like that does not need to control every nightclub to matter. It supplies men. It supplies habits. It supplies silence. It supplies a place to return to, a place where a man's old name still carries weight, a place where the street remembers whether he was ever afraid. Only Madden could move in more glamorous circles, but he could not be understood apart from the West Side that formed him. His later success was not a rejection of Hell's Kitchen. It was one of Hell's Kitchen's lessons applied on a larger stage. By the early 1930s, Prohibition was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The law had created more crime than many of its supporters expected, and the Great Depression changed the political mood. Governments needed tax revenue. Public patience with the experiment had weakened. The 21st Amendment repealed national prohibition in December of 1933, bringing the legal alcohol market back into the open. But repeal did not erase what had been built. Criminal groups did not politely close their offices and become harmless. They had money, contacts, experience, and habits of organisation. They moved into gambling, labour racketeering, loan sharking, narcotics, nightclubs, unions, protection, and other businesses where intimidation and corruption still had value. Prohibition ended, but the criminal city beneath the city had learned too much to disappear. Madden himself eventually left New York for Hot Springs, Arkansas, in the mid-1930s, a spa town with its own long history of gambling, corruption, and underworld refuge. That move tells us something about the end of one phase. The West Side Street Boy had become a national underworld figure, then a man seeking distance from the pressure of New York law enforcement and rival criminal powers. But Hell's Kitchen remained. Its streets had outlasted the farms, the old creek, the Gophers at their height, the glamour of the speakeasy years, and the repeal of the law that made bootleggers rich. The neighbourhood's reputation did not depend on one man. It had become deeper than that. After Prohibition, the old structures of danger changed shape again. The saloons were legal in new forms, the clubs adjusted, the bootlegging fortunes were redirected, the ethnic balance of organised crime shifted. The Irish gang tradition on the West Side weakened, but it did not vanish from memory or practice. The neighbourhood still had docks, warehouses, working-class families, rough bars, and men willing to use fear as currency. The old gopher world had shown how street violence could rule a block. Prohibition had shown how that street education could become a business network. The decades after repeal would show something colder, more modern, and in some ways more frightening. The next men to make Hell's Kitchen notorious would not always have the loud public style of the old gangsters. They would operate in a city with newer police methods, newer rackets, changing neighbourhoods, and a public that believed more than once that the bad old days were finally gone. But Hell's Kitchen had a way of preserving its darker lessons. The same blocks that once produced Battle Row and the Gophers would later produce another name people said carefully, a name tied to bodies, bars, extortion, and a final long shadow over the West Side. The same blocks that once produced Battle Row and the Gophers would later produce another name people said carefully, a name tied to bodies, bars, extortion, and a final long shadow over the West Side. The Westies belonged to a different New York from the Gophers, but they did not come from nowhere. They came from the same old habit of the neighbourhood, the habit of turning neglect into territory, territory into loyalty, and loyalty into fear. By the time they rose, Hell's Kitchen had already lived many lives. It had been farmland near the Hudson. It had been a working riverfront. It had been a district of Irish immigrants, tenements, saloons, freight yards, slaughterhouses, railroad tracks, street gangs, and prohibition money. It had been called dangerous for so long that danger almost seemed like part of its architecture. But the Westies made the old reputation feel current again. They gave late 20th century New York a reminder that Hell's Kitchen was not only an old story told by men remembering rough youth in smoky bars, it could still frighten people in the present. To understand why the Westies mattered, we have to understand what Hell's Kitchen was becoming after the age of Oni Madden and Prohibition. The neighbourhood did not suddenly become clean and peaceful when national prohibition ended. Repeal changed the legal status of alcohol, but it did not erase the networks built around intimidation, silence, and unofficial power. The docks still mattered, unions still mattered, bars still mattered, gambling still mattered, loan sharking still mattered. Men still needed favours, protection, cash, and introductions. The old Irish working-class identity of the neighbourhood remained strong for decades, even as the city around it changed. Families who had been there for generations knew each other's names, stories, grudges, and tragedies. A bar was not just a bar. It was an address book. A political club was not just a political club. It was a place where favours moved. A union office was not just paperwork. It could be a gate through which jobs, money, and pressure passed. That is important because organised crime does not survive only through violence. Violence gets attention, but daily power survives through relationships. A man who can get someone a job has power. A man who can make a debt disappear has power. A man who can make a debt become terrifying has more power. A man who knows which union official can be leaned on, which bar owner is vulnerable, which police officer can be trusted or avoided, and which neighbour will never speak to investigators has power that is woven into ordinary life. Hell's Kitchen had spent generations producing this kind of local knowledge. By the middle of the 20th century, the neighbourhood was no longer the old Battle Row of the 1890s, but it still knew how to keep secrets. Mickey Spillane, not the novelist but the Hell's Kitchen racketeer, came to represent the older order before the Westies as most people remember them. He controlled much of the neighbourhood's criminal life in the 1960s and 1970s, and his reputation later became complicated by comparison. People called him a gentleman gangster, which is one of those phrases that tells you as much about memory as it does about the man. It does not mean he was harmless. A man does not control rackets in Hell's Kitchen by being harmless. It means that in the stories told afterward, especially when people compared him with the men who came next, Spillane seemed restrained, local, almost old-fashioned. He was tied to bookmaking, loan sharking, waterfront influence, and the neighbourhood's political world. He was also tied by marriage to the McManus family, one of the old Irish political families of the West Side. That mattered. In Hell's Kitchen, politics and street power were never as separate as reformers wished they were. Spillane's world was built on local recognition. People knew him. Some feared him. Some respected him. Some needed him. That combination can make a criminal figure seem almost civic in a neighbourhood where official systems feel distant or unreliable. This is not praise. It is a description of how power can work when lawful authority has failed to earn full trust. A local racketeer can become part of the neighbourhood's machinery. He may hurt people and help people in the same year, even in the same week. He may collect money through fear and also solve a problem for a family who has nowhere else to go. This is how communities become morally tangled. Outsiders want clean categories. Residents often live with complicated ones. But the 1970s were not kind to old arrangements. The West Side was changing. The waterfront was changing. Construction money, union influence, real estate pressure, and the coming development of the far West Side made control of the neighbourhood more valuable and more contested. The old Irish rackets were no longer left alone simply because they had always been there. Italian organised crime families had power across New York. Younger criminals were less willing to accept old boundaries. The neighbourhood's own young men had grown up with stories of Spillane's dominance, and some of them wanted that dominance for themselves. Among them was James Coonan. Coonan's story, like so many Hell's Kitchen crime stories, begins with a grievance that became identity. He grew up in the neighbourhood, and accounts of his rise often return to a personal humiliation involving his father and Mickey Spillane. Whether every detail was told exactly the same way by everyone who remembered it, the meaning is clear. Coonan built himself around the idea that the old boss could be challenged. That is a dangerous idea in a neighbourhood where reputation is part of survival. To challenge the man who rules the block is not only to seek money, it is to rewrite the local map of fear. If the challenge fails, the challenger may be beaten, killed, or forgotten. If it succeeds, everyone learns that the old order can fall. The Westies began as Coonan and his allies tried to wrest control from Spillane and his circle. This was not a clean transfer of power. Hell's Kitchen did not hold elections for its underworld. Power moved through beatings, threats, shootings, disappearances, alliances, and the slow change in what people were afraid to say out loud. Coonan represented a harsher style than Spillane, or at least that is how the story has often been remembered. He was younger, more reckless in the beginning, and eventually more organised in the colder sense. If Spillane's reputation had been local and old-fashioned, Coonan's became something more brutal. The Westies under him did not simply inherit Hell's Kitchen's old fear, they sharpened it. Mickey Featherstone became the other central figure in that world. He was a Vietnam veteran, a man whose later cooperation with law enforcement would become crucial, but before that he was remembered as Coonan's right-hand man and one of the most feared members of the crew. Featherstone's life is one of the stranger and sadder examples of how violence can swallow a person and then leave him trying to explain himself afterward. He was not merely a side character, he was part of the Westies' inner world, the part of the gang where loyalty was tested, violence was expected, and fear was cultivated deliberately. His later decision to cooperate did not erase what he had been. It made him more dangerous to the organisation because he knew the language from inside. The Westies made money through several rackets, but loan sharking is one of the easiest to understand because it entered ordinary life so directly. A person needed money quickly. Maybe a gambler was in trouble. Maybe a business owner had cash problems. Maybe someone wanted to cover a debt before it became public. The loan came with brutal interest. At first it might seem like a solution, then it became a trap. Missed payments led to threats. Threats led to beatings. A man who borrowed from the wrong people could find that his whole life had become collateral. Loan sharking is not dramatic in the way a famous murder is dramatic, but it is one of the most intimate forms of criminal power because it reaches into fear, shame, and desperation. It turns someone's temporary need into a long-term source of control. The Westies also moved into narcotics, labour extortion, and control connected to the West Side peers. That last point ties them back to the oldest forces in the neighbourhood. The Hudson River had shaped Hell's Kitchen from the beginning. The docks had given work to immigrants, then opportunity to gangs, then influence to racketeers, and by the Westies' time the waterfront was still part of the underworld economy. The pier was not only a place where ships met land, it was a place where unions, jobs, theft, trucking, storage, and intimidation could overlap. To control a pier or influence the people who worked there was to control a small piece of the city's movement. And in New York, movement is money. Labour racketeering made the Westies more than street thugs. It put them into the machinery of the city. A gang that can influence who works, who pays, which union official feels safe, which contractor gets peace, and which job site becomes trouble is no longer only frightening in bars. It becomes part of the cost of doing business. This is one of the reasons organised crime became so difficult to uproot in New York. It did not stand outside legitimate life holding a gun. It entered legitimate life through unions, construction, trucking, waste, waterfront work, nightclubs, bars, and loans. It became a hidden tax on the city. People paid not because they approved, but because paying was cheaper than resisting. The alliance between the Westies and the Gambino crime family shows the shift clearly. The old Hell's Kitchen gangs had once been fiercely local. Their pride was Irish, West Side, neighbourhood-based. But by the late 1970s, the Westies were tied to larger Italian-American organised crime. That alliance gave them money, protection, and the use of a more famous underworld name. In return, the Gambinos received a share of the proceeds from certain illegal activity. Not everyone in the Westies liked the arrangement, and it represented a kind of surrender as well as an opportunity. The old Irish independence of Hell's Kitchen was giving way to a practical partnership with a stronger criminal power. But Coonan understood something that earlier street fighters often did not. Pride alone does not finance an empire. Alliances do. This made the Westies more dangerous because they were both small and connected. They were not a huge organisation compared with the major mafia families, but their size could be an advantage. A small crew in a tight neighbourhood can be hard to penetrate. People know each other. Outsiders stand out. Fear travels quickly. At the same time, the Gambino connection gave them access to capital, reputation, and wider criminal relationships. They could remain the local terror of Hell's Kitchen while borrowing weight from a larger underworld system. That combination made them feel larger than their numbers. A person facing the Westies was not always sure whether he was facing a handful of violent Irish gangsters or the shadow of something much bigger behind them. The violence associated with the Westies became part of their brand, and that word is ugly but accurate. They cultivated a reputation for brutality, because reputation helped them collect debts, intimidate rivals, and keep witnesses silent. Some of the crimes linked to the crew are so extreme that even in a city used to mob violence, they stood out. It is not necessary to linger over every detail. In fact, lingering can turn horror into entertainment, and that would miss the point. The point is that the violence served a function. It told people that the Westies would go further than ordinary fear expected. It made resistance feel unreasonable. It made silence feel practical. It made the neighbourhood's old reputation fresh again, not as nostalgia, but as active danger. Inside Hell's Kitchen, that danger sat beside ordinary life just as it always had. People went to work, children went to school, bars opened, apartments filled with evening noise, political clubs held events, families argued over rent and groceries, elderly residents remembered another neighbourhood, and younger ones watched developers and outsiders begin to look west with new interest. The Westies did not occupy every doorway. They did not turn every hour into violence. That is not how criminal power works in a neighbourhood. It works by being present enough that people adjust. A bar owner knows whom to greet. A union man knows which subject not to discuss. A resident knows not to repeat something heard through a wall. A mother knows when a son's new money is not good news. A witness knows that the courtroom is far away but the street is right downstairs. This is where the last fear of Hell's Kitchen lived. It was not only fear of being shot or beaten, though those fears were real. It was fear of knowing too much, fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of recognizing a face, fear of being asked a question by police when other people are watching, fear that the old rules still matter more than the new city rising around the neighbourhood. By the 1970s and 1980s, New York was changing in ways that would eventually transform Hell's Kitchen almost beyond recognition. But transformation did not arrive evenly. A new apartment building could stand near an old bar. A theatre worker could live near a lifelong resident who remembered dock gangs. A developer could look at a block and see opportunity, while an old woman on the same block still knew which names not to say. For a time, the old fear and the new money lived close together. The intrepid museum racket in the 1980s captures this mixture in a strange way. The USS Intrepid, a World War II aircraft carrier turned museum, was moored on the Hudson at Pier 86, right in the old West Side sphere. A museum sounds like the opposite of a mob racket. It suggests school trips, veterans, families, patriotic memory, tickets, exhibits, and gift shops. But the location placed it within a neighbourhood where the Westies still had influence, and members of the gang became involved in skimming money and placing people in no-show jobs. That detail is almost too perfect as a symbol. The old waterfront criminal world did not vanish because the pier now held a museum. It adapted to the new thing sitting in the old place. The river remained useful, even when the form of usefulness changed. The beginning of the end came through the same weakness that had always haunted violent crews: betrayal, mistakes, and the fact that fear cannot hold everyone forever. Mickey Featherstone's cooperation with law enforcement became crucial after he was convicted of a murder he insisted he had not committed. His wife, Cissy Featherstone, also played an important role in helping expose the gang's activities. Their cooperation gave investigators what outsiders almost never had: an inside map. The Westies had survived partly because they were local, closed, and feared. Once someone from the inner circle began explaining the structure, the old protection weakened. Names, stories, rackets, murders, meetings, relationships, and arrangements could be described in a courtroom. The silence broke, and when silence breaks in an organisation built on fear, the collapse can move quickly. The federal RICO cases against the Westies showed how law enforcement had changed since the old Gopher days. Earlier street gangs could be hit with arrests for individual crimes, but the organisation itself often survived because the structure remained intact. RICO allowed prosecutors to describe a criminal enterprise and connect acts into a pattern. That mattered for a group like the Westies, whose power came from relationships among loan sharking, narcotics, labour extortion, violence, and local control. The law was no longer only asking whether one man committed one crime on one night. It was asking whether a group operated as an enterprise. That shift helped bring down the crew in a way ordinary policing had not. When the Westies fell, Hell's Kitchen did not suddenly become innocent. Neighbourhoods do not shed memory that quickly. But the fall of Coonan's crew marked the end of a particular era. The old Irish mob power of the West Side was broken. The docks were changing. The neighbourhood's ethnic and economic makeup was shifting. The Javits Centre, Manhattan Plaza, theatre district expansion, rising rents, and real estate interest all helped pull Hell's Kitchen toward a different future. The bars did not vanish, but many changed. The tenements did not all disappear, but some became renovated buildings with higher rents and new names. The blocks that had once frightened outsiders began attracting them. The same streets that had carried a warning became marketable. Clinton, Midtown West, Hell's Kitchen. The name itself became something a real estate agent could say with a careful smile, dangerous enough to sound interesting, not dangerous enough to scare off buyers. There is something strange about that transformation. A neighbourhood spends a century being punished for being rough, and then, once the danger's mostly gone, the roughness becomes atmosphere. Old brick becomes charm. Former tenements become character. A name once spoken with fear becomes a brand. Bars lean into the history. Restaurants borrow the edge. Apartment listings hint at authenticity. People who would never have walked those blocks in the 1970s now pay high rents for the pleasure of living there. This is not unique to Hell's Kitchen. Cities do it again and again. They take places shaped by labour, poverty and danger, then sell the texture once the people who made that texture can no longer afford to remain. But the long shadow does not disappear. It lingers in names, in stories, in certain bars, in older residents, in political memory, in the way people still talk about the West Side with a little extra awareness of what it used to be. It lingers in the contrast between the old fear and the new comfort. It lingers when someone says Hell's Kitchen, and the phrase still carries heat, even though the streets outside may now hold brunch tables, dog walkers, renovated walk-ups, and commuters heading home with headphones in. A name can outlive the conditions that made it. Sometimes that is unfair. Sometimes it is useful. In this case, it reminds us that the city we see is always built over older cities that have not fully gone away. If we trace the story all the way back, the Westies look less like an isolated final burst of violence and more like the last severe expression of a much older pattern. The Hudson made the land useful. The city pushed unpleasant work westward. Immigrants filled cheap rooms near hard jobs. Tenements crowded families into conditions that made the street too important. Railroads and docks created danger, opportunity and theft. Battle Row gave the neighbourhood a vocabulary of fear. The Gophers turned that fear into street organisation. Prohibition taught men from the West Side that crime could become business. The Westies inherited the old lessons and applied them in a later city, with labour rackets, narcotics, loan sharking, union pressure, and alliances with larger organised crime. Each age changed the form. The underlying lessons stayed disturbingly similar. When a neighbourhood is neglected, used hard, and left to govern too much of itself through informal power, someone will learn to rule the space that official power fails to hold. That does not mean Hell's Kitchen was doomed. It was not. People made choices. Criminals chose violence. Landlords chose profit. Politicians chose convenience. Employers chose cheap labour. Police chose, at different times, courage, brutality, corruption or indifference. Residents chose silence, resistance, survival, loyalty, escape, or endurance depending on what the day required. History is not a machine that removes responsibility. But it does show us the pressures under which responsibility was exercised. A boy in Hell's Kitchen did not become a gangster because the Hudson River made him one. He became one because he lived inside a web of opportunity and pressure, where gangster power made a terrible kind of sense. That is harder to accept than a simple story of bad men in bad streets, but it is closer to the truth, and maybe that is why Hell's Kitchen still holds attention. It is not only the violence. Many neighbourhoods have had violence. It is the way the neighbourhood shows the whole city in miniature. Immigration, labour, industry, poverty, politics, corruption, ethnic loyalty, masculine pride, police failure, reform, organised crime, real estate, and memory all crowded into a few westward blocks. Hell's Kitchen became New York's most dangerous neighbourhood, not because it was outside the city's story, but because it was too deeply inside it. It absorbed the work other people needed done. It housed the labour other people used. It carried the smells other people did not want near them. It produced the danger other people then condemned. And finally, when the danger became less useful and the land became more valuable, the city found new ways to claim it. Tonight, if you walk there now, you may not feel any of this immediately. You may see restaurants, glass, brick, traffic, theatre crowds, corner bars, delivery bikes, apartment lights, and people walking dogs where men once watched for enemies. You may hear laughter where someone once lowered his voice. You may pass a building without knowing that older residents once treated that corner with caution. That is how cities protect themselves from memory. They keep moving. They cover one life with another, but if you stand still long enough, and if you know the story, the neighbourhood becomes layered. The quiet land beside the Hudson is still somewhere under the pavement. The tenement rooms are still present in the shape of old buildings. The rail danger still echoes in the memory of Death Avenue. Battle Row still gives its old warning. The Gophers still move through the saloon smoke of imagination. Only Madden still steps from the west side into the illegal glamour of prohibition. Mickey Spillane still represents the old local order. Coonan and Featherston still bring the last hard fear of the Westies into the story. And around all of them are the ordinary people who were never famous, the ones who lived with the consequences, paid rent, raised children, kept quiet, moved away, stayed too long, or watched the neighbourhood change until the dangerous name became something a new arrival could say without flinching. Hell's Kitchen did not become dangerous because darkness settled over it all at once. It became dangerous because the city kept asking hard things of the same streets, decade after decade, and because the people with the least protection were left closest to the pressure. The last fear faded, but the long shadow remains, not as a ghost story and not as nostalgia, but as a reminder that neighbourhoods are made by choices. Some choices are drawn on maps, some are written into rent, some are enforced with clubs, ballots, bribes, or guns. Some are made quietly when a city decides whose comfort matters and whose hardship can be treated as background noise. Hell's Kitchen carries that history in its name, even now, even under the brighter lights, even as the old danger becomes harder to see from the sidewalk.